the shadowy halls of Willow Manor, a scream pierces the night, and Sir Reginald Harrow is found stabbed in his locked study. When his nephew's fiancée, Diana, dies by poison, secrets unravelled, trampled flowers, a smudged window, a cryptic note, and a governess's hidden past, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, sees what the police miss. As suspicion falls on everyone grieving Charles, charming Vincent, nervous Clara, Miss Marple sets a clever trap, weaving clues from a St. Mary Mead village to catch a killer before they strike again. Will her genius move save the manor, or will its dark secrets bury the truth forever? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Willow Manor. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy parlour in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking softly. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on the faded rug. Outside, the autumn leaves swirled in the chilly breeze, painting the village in shades of gold and red. She was a small, neat woman with snowy hair, bright blue eyes, and a gentle smile that hid a mind sharper than attack. Her hands moved steadily, looping yarn into a scarf, but her thoughts wandered to the letter on the table beside her. It had arrived that morning, written in a familiar, looping hand. Lady Beatrice Harrow, an old friend from years past, had invited her to Willow Manor, a grand estate in the nearby village of Danbury. The occasion was a weekend party to celebrate the engagement of Beatrice's nephew, Charles Harrow, to a wealthy young woman named Diana Voss. The letter bubbled with cheer, describing the manor's gardens, the fine dinners, and the joy of the young couple. But Miss Marple, who had a knack for spotting trouble beneath the surface, felt a prickle of unease. The words were too bright, too eager, like a smile that didn't reach the eyes. She set her knitting down and picked up the letter again. "My dear Jane," it began, "you simply must come. Charles is so happy, and Diana is a delight. We'll have a splendid time, and I long to hear your stories from St. Mary Mead." The ink was bold, but a faint smudge on the edge suggested haste. Beatrice wasn't one to rush her writing. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Something was off, though she couldn't yet say what. She glanced at the clock. The train to Danbury left in 2 hours. Her suitcase, already packed with her best wool dresses and a warm shawl, sat by the door. She'd told her maid, Mary, she'd be gone a few days. Just a little holiday, she'd said, but her sharp eyes had already begun to work, piecing together the puzzle she sensed waiting at Willow Manor. The train journey was pleasant, the countryside rolling by in a patchwork of fields and hedges. Miss Marple sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the world pass. She thought of Beatrice, a kind but nervous woman who wore her wealth lightly. They'd met years ago at a charity bazaar, bonding over a shared love of gardening. Beatrice had a good heart, but a tendency to fret, especially about her family. Her nephew, Charles, was her pride and joy. Though Miss Marple recalled whispers of his reckless youth debts and wild friends now supposedly behind him, this Diana Voss, the fiancée, was a mystery. The letter called her charming, but charm, Miss Marple knew, could hide all sorts of secrets. The train pulled into Danbury station as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows. A driver in a neat cap waited with a sign, Miss Marple. He was a young man, broad-shouldered, with a shy smile. "I'm Tom, ma'am," he said, taking her suitcase. "Lady Harrow sent me to fetch you." "Thank you, Tom," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear. She noticed his calloused hands and the faint mud on his boots, suggesting he doubled as a gardener. Is it far to Willow Manor? Not far, ma'am. 10 minutes by car. He led her to a polished black motor car, its engine humming softly. As they drove, Miss Marple watched the scenery shift from village cottages to rolling hills. Willow Manor soon came into view, a sprawling stone house with ivy-covered walls and tall chimneys. Its windows glowed golden in the dusk, promising warmth, but the dark woods surrounding it gave an air of secrets. Tom pulled up to the front steps, where Beatrice Harrow waited, her hands clasped tightly. She was a plump woman in her 60s, with greying curls and a dress of soft blue silk. Her smile was wide but strained, her eyes darting to the car before settling on Miss Marple. "Jane, oh Jane." Beatrice rushed forward, grasping Miss Marple's hands. "I'm so glad you're here. It's been too long." "Far too long," Miss Marple agreed, returning the smile. She noted Beatrice's grip, a little too tight, and the faint lines of worry around her mouth. "You look well, Beatrice, but I dare say you're working too hard to make this party perfect." Beatrice laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Oh, you know me, always fussing. Come inside, you must be chilled." She led Miss Marple into the entrance. Whole, a grand space with a marble floor and a chandelier glittering overhead. A wide staircase curved upward, and portraits of stern-faced Harrows lined the walls. The air smelled of polished wood and roses, but Miss Marple caught a faint whiff of something sharp as cigar smoke. "Perhaps you'll meet everyone at dinner," Beatrice said, guiding her to a guest room upstairs. "Charles is so eager to show off Diana, and my brother, Reginald, is here too. He's a bit grumpy, but don't mind him. And there's Clara, the governess, and Mr. Lyle, a friend of Charles's. Such a lively group." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the hall. A maid hurried past, carrying a tray, her face pale and tense. A man's voice, loud and cheerful, echoed from a nearby room, followed by a woman's laugh. The house was alive, but beneath the bustle, Miss Marple sensed a current of unease, like a river running under ice. Her room was charming, with a four-poster bed, a small fireplace, and a window overlooking the gardens. Beatrice fussed over the pillows, chatting about the party plans. "Dinner's at 7, she said. "I'll send Clara to fetch you. She's such a dear, been with us since the children were small, though there's only young Tommy now, my grandnephew. He's away." "At school?" "Clara sounds lovely," Miss Marple said, unpacking her shawl. "And Charles, is he as happy as your letter says?" Beatrice's smile faltered. "Oh yes, very happy. Diana's a treasure, though. Well, families, you know, there's always a bit of fuss." She laughed again, but it sounded forced. "Rest now, Jane. I'll see you soon." Left alone, Miss Marple sat by the window, watching the gardens fade into twilight. The flower beds were neat, but a patch near the house looked trampled, as if someone had walked through it carelessly. She filed the detail away, her mind already sifting through Beatrice's words. Families, indeed. In St. Mary Mead, a bit of fuss often meant secrets, jealousies, or worse. She changed into a simple black dress, pinning a brooch to her collar. Her reflection in the mirror showed a frail-looking woman, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. She thought of a case back home, when young Tommy Price's fuss with his cousin turned out to be a stolen watch and a fistfight. Small clues, she knew, could unravel big troubles. At 10 minutes to 7, a knock came at the door. A young woman entered, slim and pale, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her grey dress was plain, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple, I'm Clara, the governess. Lady Harrow asked me to bring you to dinner." "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said, smiling warmly. She noticed the girl's nervous glance at the floor and the way her fingers clutched the handkerchief, as if it were a lifeline. "Have you been with the Harrows long?" "5 years, ma'am," Clara said, her voice soft. "Since Tommy was little." She hesitated, then added, "It's a fine house. Everyone's kind." Miss Marple nodded, sensing the girl's unease. "It's a lovely place," she said, following Clara downstairs. "Though big houses always have their stories, don't they?" Clara's step faltered, but she said nothing. They reached the dining room, a long space with a polished table set for 6. A chandelier sparkled above, and candles flickered, casting shadows on the walls. Beatrice stood near the head of the table, chatting with a tall, handsome man in his 30s. Charles Harrow, Miss Marple guessed. His dark hair was neatly combed, but his smile seemed forced, his eyes flicking to the door. "Jane, come meet Charles," Beatrice called, waving her over. Charles shook Miss Marple's hand, his grip firm but quick. "A pleasure, Miss Marple," he said. "Aunt Beatrice says you're the cleverest woman she knows." "Oh, nonsense," Miss Marple said, chuckling. "I'm just an old lady who likes to listen." She studied Charles, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way he glanced at a striking woman across the room. That must be Diana Voss. Diana was a vision, with golden hair piled high and a red dress that hugged her curves. She laughed at something a man beside her said, her voice bright and musical. The man, lean and smooth-faced with slicked-back hair, wore a tailored suit and a charming grin. Miss Marple pegged him as Mr. Vincent Lyle, the businessman Beatrice mentioned. "Miss Marple, this is Diana," Charles said, leading her over. Diana's green eyes sparkled as she extended a hand, her perfume sweet and strong. "So you're the famous Miss Marple," Diana said, her tone teasing. "Charles says you solve mysteries in your sleep." "Hardly," Miss Marple replied, smiling. "I just notice things, like anyone might." She caught a flicker of unease in Diana's eyes, quickly masked by another laugh. Vincent Lyle stepped forward, bowing slightly. "Vincent Lyle, at your service. I'm a friend of Charles's, here to toast the happy couple." His voice was smooth, like honey, but Miss Marple noted the calculating glint in his eyes, like a shopkeeper sizing up a customer. Before she could respond, a gruff voice cut in. "Beatrice, must we stand about chattering?" A tall man with a grey moustache and a stern face strode in, his black suit crisp. This was Sir Reginald Harrow, Beatrice's brother. His eyes, cold and sharp, swept over the group, lingering on Diana with a frown. "Reginald, don't be cross," Beatrice said, her voice tight. "This is Jane Marple, my dear friend." Sir Reginald gave a curt nod. "Miss Marple, welcome." He turned away, pouring himself a glass of sherry from a decanter on the sideboard. Miss Marple noted his stiff posture and the way Beatrice's hands fluttered, as if smoothing an invisible wrinkle. Dinner was announced, and they took their seats. Miss Marple sat between Beatrice and Clara, with Charles across from Diana, Vincent beside her, and Sir Reginald at the head. The first course, a creamy soup, was served by a maid whose hands trembled slightly. Miss Marple watched the table, her eyes soft but alert, catching every glance. Every pause, Charles spoke loudly about the wedding plans, his voice too cheerful. "Diana's chosen a dress from Paris," he said, glancing at her. "It'll be the talk of London." Diana smiled, touching his hand. "You're too sweet, darling." But her eyes flicked to Vincent, who smirked over his soup. Miss Marple sipped her own, noting the exchange. In St. Mary Mead, such looks often meant trouble lovers' quarrels, or worse, Sir Reginald ate in silence, his frown deepening when Diana laughed. Beatrice tried to keep the talk light, asking Miss Marple about her garden. "Do your roses still bloom so well, Jane?" "Oh, they manage," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "though they need watching, like people do. Neglect brings trouble." She smiled, but her words hung in the air, and Clara's spoon clinked. Against her bowl, Vincent leaned forward, his charm turned on like a lamp. "Miss Marple, you must tell us about St. Mary Mead. Any scandals lately?" "Nothing grand," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Just the usual folks, arguing over money. Or love. It's much the same everywhere, I find." Vincent's smile tightened, and Miss Marple filed it away. Like a card in her mental index, the main course arrived: roast lamb with minted peas, but the conversation faltered. Sir Reginald muttered about the cost of the wedding, his voice sharp. "Wasteful nonsense," he said, glaring at Charles. "You'd do better to settle down quietly." Charles flushed, his jaw tight. "It's not wasteful, uncle. It's what Diana wants." Diana patted his arm, but her smile was cool. "Reginald, you're too serious. Life's for living, isn't it?" Her tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the edge, like a knife hidden. In silk, Clara said little, her eyes on her plate. Miss Marple tried to draw her out, asking about young Tommy. "He's a bright boy," Clara said softly. "Loves books. He's at boarding school now." Her voice shook, and she looked away. Miss Marple wondered what made the girl so nervous, fear of the grand setting or something deeper. As dessert was served apple tart with creme, talk turned to the manor's history. Beatrice mentioned an old family feud over the estate. Settled years ago, but still a sore spot for Reginald. "He loves Willow Manor," she said, glancing at her brother. "Hates the idea of it passing to anyone else." Reginald grunted, pushing his plate away. "It's a duty, Beatrice, not a toy for spendthrifts." His eyes flicked to Charles, who stared at his tart, his knuckles white dot. Miss Marple listened, her face calm but her mind racing. Money, love, and family pried old motives, as common in St. Mary Mead as in grand houses like this. She thought of a village girl, jilted and angry, who'd broken windows to spite her lover. Small acts, big feelings. What feelings stirred here? After dinner, the group moved to the drawing room for coffee. Vincent offered Diana a cigarette, lighting it with a flourish. Charles watched, his mouth tight. Sir Reginald sat by the fire, a book in hand, ignoring everyone. Beatrice chatted with Miss Marple about old times, but her eyes kept darting to the others, as if expecting trouble. Miss Marple sipped her coffee, her gaze soft but sharp. She noticed Clara slip out, her handkerchief left on a chair. Curious. Miss Marple excused herself and followed, pretending to need air. In the hall, she saw Clara pause by a window, staring into the dark garden. The girl's shoulders shook, as if she were crying. Miss Marple stepped back, not wanting to intrude, but her mind noted the detail. Clara, nervous and secretive, alone in the night. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple caught a snatch of conversation between Vincent and Diana. "It's all set," Vincent murmured, his voice low. "Don't back out now." Diana's laugh was sharp, and she turned away as Miss Marple approached. The evening ended early, with Beatrice pleading a headache. Charles and Diana said good night, their hands linked but their smiles strained. Vincent lingered, offering Miss Marple a charming bow. Sleep well, Miss Marple. No mysteries tonight, I hope. Oh, I'm sure there's always a little mystery, she said, her eyes twinkling. It's what makes life interesting. Sir Reginald merely nodded as he left, his face grim. Miss Marple climbed the stairs to her room, her steps slow but her mind alert. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a quiet word or a misplaced glance could unravel a scandal. Willow Manor, with its polished surfaces and hidden tensions, was no different. In her room, she sat by the fire, knitting forgotten in her lap. The trampled flower bed, Clara's nerves, Vincent's whispers, Reginald's anger, Charles's unease, Diana's sharp look, small pieces, but they fit somewhere. She thought of a village boy caught stealing apples because he couldn't resist showing off. Pride, greed, love, they drove people to act, and sometimes to kill. She blew out her candle and settled into bed, the manor quiet around her, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind turned, sorting clues like yarn, knowing that somewhere in this house trouble waited. Tomorrow she'd watch closer, listen harder. For now she closed her eyes, trusting her knack for seeing what others missed. Chapter 2. Whispers in the drawing room. The dining room at Willow Manor glowed with candlelight. The long table set with gleaming silver and delicate china. Miss Jane Marple sat near Lady Beatrice Harrow, her old friend, her hands folded neatly. In her lap, her soft grey dress and simple brooch made her look like any elderly aunt, but her bright blue eyes missed nothing. The air was thick with the scent of roast lamb and roses, yet beneath the warmth, Miss Marple felt a chill, like a draught from an unseen window. The guest Charles Harrow, his fiancée Diana Voss, the charming Mr. Vincent Lisle, the stern Sir Reginald Harrow, and the nervous governess Clara were all smiles and chatter, but their voices carried an edge, like glass about to crack. Dinner had begun pleasantly enough. Beatrice, ever the anxious hostess, kept the talk flowing, asking about Miss Marple's roses and the quiet life in St. Mary Mead. Charles, a handsome man with dark hair and a tense smile, spoke loudly about his wedding plans, his arm brushing. Diana, radiant in her red dress, laughed at his words, but her green eyes darted to Vincent, who sat across from her, his slicked back hair catching the light. Vincent's smile was smooth, his words polished, but Miss Marple noted how his fingers tapped the table, restless. Sir Reginald, at the head of the table, ate in silence, his grey moustache twitching when Diana spoke. Clara, the governess, kept her head down, her pale hands clutching her fork too tightly. Miss Marple sipped her soup, a creamy blend of leeks and potatoes, and listened. She had a way of fading into the background, her gentle nods and soft smiles letting others forget how closely she watched. In St. Mary Mead, she'd solved many a puzzle by noticing small things, a glance, a pause, a word left unsaid. Here, at Willow Manor, the small things were piling up like leaves in a storm. "Jane, you must tell us about your village," Beatrice said, her voice bright but strained. "Any exciting tales lately?" Her hands fluttered over her napkin, smoothing it again and again. "Oh, nothing much," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "Just the usual squabbles, someone's cow straying, or a tiff over a church bazaar. People are much the same everywhere, I find." She smiled, but her eyes flicked to Charles, who was staring at his plate, his jaw tight. Diana laughed, her voice like a bell. "A cow straying. How quaint. You make it sound so peaceful, miss." She leaned toward Charles, her hand on his arm, but her gaze slid to Vincent, who raised his glass with a wink. "Peaceful on the surface, Miss Marple said, her voice mild. But surfaces hide things, don't they? Like a pond with dark water. Underneath, her words hung in the air, and Clara's spoon clinked loudly against her bowl. The governess blushed, mumbling an apology. Sir Reginald grunted, his cold eyes on Diana. Too much chatter about nothing, he said, cutting his lamb with precision. This house doesn't need more noise. His tone was sharp, and Smile faltered. Now, Reginald, she said, let's not be grumpy. It's a happy occasion. But her hands twisted her napkin, and Miss Marple noted the worry in her eyes. Beatrice had hinted in her letter about family tensions, something about Charles's inheritance, and Reginald's disapproval of Diana. Miss Marple wondered how deep those tensions ran. Charles cleared his throat, forcing a grin. Uncle's right, let's keep it cheerful. Diana's been planning the wedding, and it's going to be splendid. Right, darling. He looked at Diana, but his voice had a pleading note, as if he needed her to agree. Splendid, yes, Diana said, her smile dazzling. Paris gowns, flowers everywhere. It'll be the talk of the town. She tossed her head, her golden curls catching the light, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or defiance. Vincent leaned forward, his charm turned up like a lamp. A grand wedding suit, a grand lady, he said, his eyes locked on Diana. Charles is a lucky man. His tone was warm, but Miss Marple saw Charles's hand tighten on his knife, his knuckles white. Luck's got nothing to do with it, Charles said, his voice tight. It's about love, isn't it? He looked at Diana, but she was sipping her wine, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple watched the exchange, her mind ticking. In St. Mary Mead, she'd seen young men like Charles eager, a bit reckless, quick to bristle when their pride was pricked, and women like Diana, all charm and sparkle, often had secrets. She thought of a village girl, Lily, who'd flirted with 2 boys and caused a fist fight behind the pub. Love, pride, jealousy, old motives. As common here as in her village. The meal moved to dessert, a warm apple tart with cream. Beatrice tried to lighten the mood, talking about the Manor's gardens. Jane, you'd love the roses, she said. They're still blooming, even in October. I'd like to see them, Miss Marple said, smiling. Gardens tell stories, you know. A trampled flower bed, a broken stem, they show where someone's been. Her words were gentle, but Clara's fork paused mid-air, and Vincent's smile stiffened. Miss Marple filed it away like a note in her knitting bag. As the maid cleared the plates, Sir Reginald pushed back his chair. I've had enough, he said, his voice gruff. I'll be in my study. He strode out, leaving a heavy silence. Beatrice's face fell, and she hurried to apologize. He's always like that, she said, her voice trembling. Reginald loves the Manor, but he's so protective of it, doesn't like change. She glanced at Charles, who was staring at his empty plate, his face red dot. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind, but her mind sharp. Protective, yes, but was it the Manor or something else? She thought of old Mr. Bates in St. Mary Mead, who guarded his shop like a dragon because he'd hidden stolen coins in the cellar. Secrets made people fierce. The group moved to the drawing room for coffee, a cozy space with velvet chairs and a roaring fire. The windows looked out on the dark gardens, where shadows shifted in the moonlight. Miss Marple settled near Beatrice, her hands folded, her eyes roaming. Charles stood by Diana, his arm around her, but his smile was forced. Vincent lounged by the fireplace, lighting a cigarette with a silver lighter. Clara sat in a corner, her hands twisting her handkerchief, her face pale. Beatrice poured coffee, her hands unsteady, spilling a drop on the tray. "Jane, you take yours black, don't you?" Beatrice asked, her voice too bright. "Yes, thank you," Miss Marple said, taking the cup. She noticed the maid, the same pale girl from earlier, hovering by the door, her eyes darting to Clara. Something passed between them, a quick glance, almost secret. Miss Marple sipped her coffee, her mind turning. Vincent broke the silence, his voice smooth. "Miss Marple, you must have seen some scandals in your village. Tell us a good one." He grinned, but his eyes were sharp, like a cat watching a mouse. "Nothing too exciting," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "Just people being people, falling in love, falling out, hiding little wrongs. Like the time our baker's boy stole a pie to impress a girl, got caught because he left crumbs on her doorstep." She chuckled, but her eyes flicked to Vincent, who laughed a bit too loudly. "Crumbs, eh?" he said. "You've got a sharp eye, Miss Marple. Old eyes see more than young ones, sometimes," she said, smiling. She thought of a St. Mary Mead widow who'd caught her neighbour sneaking out at night, all because of a muddy shoe left by the gate. Small clues, big truths. Diana excused herself to freshen up, her red dress swishing as she left. Charles watched her go, his face tight. Miss Marple noticed Vincent's eyes follow her, his smile fading. Beatrice, trying to keep things cheerful, asked Clara about young Tommy, the grandnephew at boarding school. "He's doing well," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Loves his books." Her fingers twisted the handkerchief, and Miss Marple saw a small ring on her hand, its stone glinting faintly. It looked out of place on the governess's plain dress. Too fine for her station. "That's lovely," Beatrice said, but her eyes were on Charles, who was pacing by the window. "Charles, do sit down. You're making me nervous." "Sorry, Aunt," Charles said, forcing a smile. He sat, but his foot tapped the floor, restless. Miss Marple wondered what weighed on him, love, money or something darker. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple excused herself to stretch her legs. She wandered toward the hall, her steps slow, her ears sharp. The house was quiet, save for the distant clink of dishes in the kitchen. She paused by a side door leading to the garden, noticing it was slightly ajar. A faint breeze carried the scent of damp earth and something else, cigar smoke, sharp and fresh. She peered out, seeing only darkness, but her mind noted the detail. Someone had been outside. Recently, returning to the drawing room, she passed a narrow corridor leading to Sir Reginald's study. Low voices stopped her romance, sharp and urgent, and another, too soft to make out. She edged closer, her heart steady, her ears straining. "Settle the debt, or it's over," the man said, his voice low but clear. It was Vincent, she was sure, his smooth tone gone rough. The other voice murmured, too faint to hear. A door clicked shut, and silence fell. Miss Marple stepped back, her mind racing. Debt money, always a dangerous word. In St. Mary Mead, a farmer had lost his land over debts, and his anger had led to a broken fence and a dead sheep. She wondered who Vincent was speaking to, perhaps, or Diana, or someone else entirely. Back in the drawing room, the mood had shifted. Diana had returned, her lipstick fresh, but her smile was tight. Charles stood by her, his hand on her shoulder, but his eyes were on Vincent, who was chatting with Beatrice as if nothing had happened. Clara was still in her corner, her handkerchief now a crumpled ball. Miss Marple took her seat, her face calm, but her thoughts were like her knitting needles, looping clues into patterns. Beatrice yawned, her face pale. "I'm afraid I'm rather tired," she said. "Perhaps we should all turn in. Jane, you must be exhausted after your journey." "A little rest would be nice," Miss Marple said, rising. "It's been a lovely evening." Her tone was polite, but her eyes lingered on each guest Charles's tension. Diana's forced cheer, Vincent's sly grin, Clara's trembling hands. Something was brewing, and she meant to find out what. As the group said goodnight, Miss Marple caught Clara's eye. The governess looked away quickly, her ring catching the light again. Miss Marple smiled to herself, thinking of a St. Mary Mead girl who'd worn a stolen brooch and thought no one noticed. Small things she knew could unravel big secrets. She climbed the stairs to her room, her steps slow but steady. The manor was quiet now, but the silence felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. In her room, she sat by the window, looking out at the dark gardens. The trampled flower bed she'd seen earlier was hidden in shadow, but she pictured it clearly broken stems, careless steps, and now cigar smoke and whispered debts. Pieces of a puzzle, not yet clear, but forming. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a quiet word in the post office could reveal a scandal. Willow Manor was grander, but people were the same, full of hopes, fears, and secrets. She settled into bed, her knitting on the table, her mind still turning. Tomorrow she'd watch. Closer, listen harder. Trouble was near, and Miss Marple was ready for it. Chapter 3. The midnight screamed. The clock in Miss Jane Marple's guest room at Willow Manor ticked softly, its hands glowing faintly in the moonlight. She lay awake, her white hair tucked under a nightcap, her hands resting on the quilt. The manor was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood settling. Her mind, sharp as ever, turned over the evening's events, Charles Harrow's tense smiles, Diana Voss's sly glances, Vincent Lyle's whispered talk of debts, Clara the governess's nervous hands, and Sir Reginald Harrow's grim frown. The house felt like a puzzle, its pieces scattered, waiting for her to fit them together. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a quiet night could hide secrets. Once old Mrs. Carter had heard whispers outside her cottage, only to find her neighbour plotting to steal her savings. Small clues, whispers, glances, a trampled flower bed always led somewhere. Miss Marple's eyes were half closed when a sharp, piercing scream shattered the silence. She sat up, heart steady but alert. The scream came from downstairs, high and frightened, followed by a thud and muffled voices. She slipped on her robe, her movements quick despite her age, and lit a candle. Its flame flickered as she opened her door and stepped into the dark hallway. Footsteps echoed below, and a man's voice, Charles, she thought, called out, "What's happened? Who's there?" Miss Marple moved to the staircase, her candle casting long shadows on the portraits lining the wall. Below, in the entrance hall, Lady Beatrice Harrow stood in her nightgown, her face pale, clutching a shawl. Charles was beside her, his hair mussed, his eyes wide. Diana Voss appeared, her silk robe loosely tied, her golden hair tumbling over her shoulders. Vincent Lyle followed, his shirt untucked, looking less polished than at dinner. Clara, the governess, hovered at the edge of the group, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her face ghostly white. "It came from the study," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. Reginald's study. Charles pushed past, striding toward a heavy oak door off the hall. "Uncle, are you all right?" He rattled the handle, but the door was locked. He pounded on it, his voice rising. "Uncle Reginald, open the door." Miss Marple reached the bottom of the stairs, her candle steady. She noted the group's faces, Beatrice's fear, Charles's panic, Diana's wide-eyed stare, Vincent's tight jaw, Clara's trembling lips. The air was thick with dread, and a faint scent lingered, sweet and sharp, like perfume. She filed it away, her mind clicking like her knitting needles. "Stand back," Vincent said, his voice sharp. He shouldered the door, once, twice, until it gave way with a splintering crack. The group poured into the study, a dim room lined with bookshelves and heavy furniture. A single lamp burned on the desk, casting a pool of light. Sir Reginald Harrow sat slumped in his chair, his head tilted back, his grey moustache still. An antique letter opener, its handle carved with ivy, protruded from his chest. Blood stained his shirt, dark and spreading dot. Beatrice gasped, clutching Charles's arm. "Reginald, oh no." She swayed, and Miss Marple stepped forward, gently guiding her to a chair. There, Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her voice calm. "Sit down, dear. We mustn't touch anything." Her eyes swept the room, taking in every detail: the locked window, its latch firm, the scattered papers on the desk, a glass of sherry tipped over, its contents pooling on the wood. The perfume scent was stronger here, mingling with the coppery tang of blood. Charles knelt by his uncle, his hands shaking. He's dead," he said, his voice breaking. "Who did this?" Diana touched his shoulder, her face pale but composed. "Charles, darling, don't. Let's wait for the police." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed her. Eyes darted to the window, then to Vincent, who stood by the door, his face unreadable dot. Clara let out a small sob, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. "It's awful," she whispered. "Who would do such a thing?" Vincent cleared his throat. "We need to call the police, now." He moved to the telephone on the desk, but paused, glancing at Miss Marple. "Unless you think we should wait." Miss Marple called them, she said, her tone mild but firm. "And don't touch the desk. The police will want everything as it is." She stepped closer to the body, her candle held high, her eyes scanning without seeming to stare. The letter opener was old, part of the Manners collection, she'd wager. The wound was precise, suggesting strength and intent. The window locked. From the inside ruled out an outsider, or so it seemed. Beatrice sobbed quietly, her hands twisting her shawl. "Reginald was so stubborn," she said, "always locking himself away in here. But who would?" Her voice trailed off, her eyes wide with fear. Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. In St. Mary Mead, a locked room had once hidden a theft, the culprit sneaking in through a forgotten coal chute. She glanced at the window again, noting its heavy frame and the dust on the sill, undisturbed except for a faint smudge near the latch. Curious, she thought. Vincent returned, saying, "The police are on their way. Inspector Crane, from Danbury. He'll be here soon." His voice was calm, but Miss Marple saw his fingers tap his thigh, a nervous habit from dinner. Charles stood, his face red with anger. "This is madness. Who was in the house?" "We were all asleep." He looked at Diana, then Vincent, his eyes narrowing. "Or were we?" "Charles, don't," Diana said, her tone sharp. "You're upset. We all are." She glanced at Miss Marple, as if expecting her to agree. Miss Marple said nothing, her eyes on Clara, who stood frozen, her handkerchief now a crumpled ball. The governess's ring glinted faintly, catching the candlelight. Miss Marple recalled. The ring from dinner, too fine for a governess. Perhaps a gift or something more. She thought of a St. Mary Mead girl who'd worn a stolen locket, her guilt plain in her nervous hands. The police arrived within the hour, their boots loud on the marble floor. Inspector Crane was a tall man with a square jaw and tired eyes, his notebook already open. His assistant, Sergeant Trotter, a young man with a nervous energy, followed close behind. The guests were herded into the drawing room, where the fire had died to embers. Miss Marple sat near Beatrice, her candle now out, her hands folded, her ears sharp. Inspector Crane surveyed the group, his gaze steady. "I'll need statements from everyone," he said. "No one leaves the house until we've sorted this out. Miss Marple, is it? Lady Harrow says you're a guest." "Yes, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "Just visiting for the weekend." "Such a terrible thing." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes noted Crane's quick glance at Charles, who stood by the window, his fists clenched. Crane turned to Beatrice. "Lady Harrow, when did you last see your brother?" "At dinner," Beatrice said, her voice shaky. "He was cross, as usual. He went to his study afterward. He often worked late." She dabbed her eyes with her shawl, and Miss Marple patted her hand again, noting her friend's genuine grief. "And the scream?" Crane asked. "Who heard it first?" "I did," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "I was in my room, reading. It woke me." Her hands trembled, and Miss Marple saw her glance at the door, as if wishing to flee. "I heard it too," Charles said, his voice hoarse. "I ran downstairs and found Aunt Beatrice in the hall. Then we all came." Diana nodded. "I was asleep. But the scream woke me. I followed Charles." Her robe slipped slightly, revealing a silk nightgown, and Miss Marple noted the faint scent of her perfume suite, like the one in the study. Vincent shrugged. "I was in my room, smoking, heard the scream and came down." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple saw his eyes flick to Diana, then away. Crane scribbled in his notebook. "The study door was locked, you say, and the window locked," Charles said. "I checked it myself after we broke in." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind turned to the smudge on the windowsill. Locked, yes, but windows could be tampered with. She thought of a St. Mary Mead burglary where a locked door had been opened with a hairpin. Small tricks, big lies. Crane sent Sergeant Trotter to examine the study, then turned to the group. "I'll speak to each of you alone. For now, stay here. No wandering." He glanced at Miss Marple as if sizing her up, then left for the study. The drawing room was quiet, the air heavy. Beatrice sat with her head in her hands, murmuring about Reginald's stubborn ways. Charles paced, his eyes darting to Diana, who sat calmly, brushing a curl from her face. Vincent lit another cigarette, the smoke curling upward. Lara clutched her handkerchief, her ring glinting again. Miss Marple watched them all, her face serene but her mind like a spider's web, catching every detail. She thought of the perfume Diana's, perhaps, but why in the study? And the smudge on the windowsill, so faint but there. The letter opener, too, was curious part of the manor's decor, not a weapon you'd carry. Someone had planned this, or acted in haste, grabbing what was near. In St. Mary Mead, a farmhand had once used a pitchfork in a fit of rage, leaving clues in his muddy boots. She wondered what clues lay here. Beatrice looked up, her eyes red. "Jane, how could this happen?" Reginald was difficult, but to be Murdered. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple squeezed her hand. It's dreadful, Beatrice, she said, but the truth always comes out, like weeds in a garden. You just have to look closely. Her words were gentle, but her eyes flicked to Clara, who flinched. Charles stopped pacing, his voice low. It's got to be someone outside. A thief, maybe. The manor's full of valuables. He looked at Diana, as if seeking her agreement. But she only nodded, her expression cool. Vincent exhaled smoke, his tone light. A thief in a locked room. Sounds like one of your village mysteries, Miss Marple. He smiled, but his eyes were sharp, watching her. Oh, I've seen stranger things, Miss Marple said, her voice mild. In St. Mary Mead, a locked shed. Hid a stolen bicycle, all because the lock was old and loose. Things aren't always as they seem. Her words were soft, but Vincent's smile faded, and he looked away. Crane returned, his face grim. The study's secure. No signs of a break-in. But we'll check the grounds at dawn. Miss Marple, you first, if you don't mind. He gestured to a small parlour off the drawing-room, and she followed, her steps slow but steady. Inside, Crane sat at a table, his notebook open. You're a friend of Lady Harrow's, he said. Notice anything odd tonight? Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded. I'm just a guest, Inspector, here for the engagement party. But I did notice tensions. Families often have them, don't they? Charles seemed worried, and Sir Reginald was cross at dinner, and Clara, the governess, is very nervous. She paused, her eyes soft but keen, and there was a scream of course, quite chilling. Crane nodded, scribbling. Anything else? You seem like someone who sees things. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only what anyone might see, Inspector. The study window was locked, but there's a smudge on the sill, and a scent perfume, perhaps, near the body. Small things, but they add up, like stitches in a scarf. She spoke lightly, but her words landed like pebbles in a pond. Crane's eyes narrowed. Perfume, you say, and a smudge. We'll look into it. He stood, signalling the end of the talk. Thank you, Miss Marple. Stay in the drawing-room with the others. She returned to the group, her face calm but her mind buzzing. The perfume was a clue, but whose? Diana's scent was similar, but Clara had been near the study earlier, and governesses didn't usually wear perfume. And the smudge had someone tampered with the window, or was it a trick to make the murder seem impossible? She thought of a St. Mary Mead case where a ghost turned out to be a boy sneaking through a loose window, leaving smudges on the frame. The night dragged on, the group restless in the drawing-room. Charles muttered about thieves. Diana sipped tea with a steady hand. Vincent smoked silently, and Clara stared at the floor, her ring catching the light. Beatrice dozed fitfully, her shawl slipping. Miss Marple sat quietly, her eyes half closed, but missing nothing. The manor felt like a stage, the players hiding their true roles. As dawn approached, Crane called them back to their rooms, posting Sergeant Trotter at the hall. No one leaves until we've searched the grounds, he said. Miss Marple climbed the stairs, her candle relit, her mind turning. The murder was no random act-to-letter opener, a locked room, a scent of perfume. Someone in this house had a secret, and she meant to find it. In her room, she sat by the window, the sky grey with early light. The trampled flower bed below was clearer now, its broken stems stark against the neat rows. She thought of the whispered argument she'd overheard Vincent's talk of debts. Was it tied to Reginald's death? And Clara's ring, so out of place, stolen perhaps, or a gift with strings attached. In St. Mary Mead, a ring had once led to a jilted lover's revenge. Small clues, big truths. She blew out her candle, her mind still knitting patterns. The scream had been the start, but the real work lay ahead. Trouble was here, and Miss Marple was ready to unravel it, one stitch at a time. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Motivet. Morning after the midnight scream, Willow Manor felt like a house holding its breath. The grand dining room, so lively with candlelight the night before, was now dim, the curtains half drawn against the grey. October dawn. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her hands folded over her napkin, her blue eyes soft but sharp. Her grey dress was neat, her brooch pinned precisely, but her mind was far from the cold toast and tea before her. Sir Reginald Harrow's murder-stabbed in his locked study, with an antique letter opener hung over the house like a storm cloud. The guests, gathered reluctantly, were silent, their faces pale and drawn. Lady Beatrice Harrow, red-eyed from crying, picked at her toast, her hands trembling. Charles Harrow, her nephew, sat with his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on his plate, avoiding his fiancée, Diana Voss, who sipped coffee with a calm that seemed forced. Vincent Lyle, the smooth-talking businessman, stirred his tea slowly, his usual grin absent. Clara, the governess, sat at the table's edge, her hands twisting her handkerchief, her face so pale it looked like chalk. Inspector Crane and his assistant, Sergeant Trotter, had taken over the small parlour for interviews, and the air buzzed with unspoken fears. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts weaving like her knitting. The locked study, the perfume scent, the smudge on the window-sill, the whispered talk of debts she'd overheard all, were threads in a pattern not yet clear. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a locked barn had hidden a stolen horse, the thief caught because of a muddy footprint. Small clues, she knew, could unravel big crimes. Her eyes moved over the guests, catching Charles's clenched jaw, Diana's quick glance at Vincent, Clara's trembling fingers, and Beatrice's nervous flutter. Trouble was here, and she meant to find its shape. Inspector Crane entered, his square jaw set, his notebook tucked under his arm. Sergeant Trotter followed, his young face eager but nervous. "We'll start the interviews now," Crane said, his voice firm, "one at a time, in the parlour. No one leaves the house until we're done. Lady Harrow, you first." Beatrice nodded, her shawl slipping as she stood. "Of course, Inspector," she said, her voice shaky. She glanced at Miss Marple, her eyes pleading, as if hoping her friend could make sense of the horror. Miss Marple gave a small, reassuring smile, but her mind was already turning, sorting the night's clues like cards. As Beatrice left, the others sat in silence. Charles pushed his plate away, his voice low. "This is a nightmare. Who'd want to kill Uncle Reginald?" He was grumpy, but his words trailed off, and he looked at Diana, who reached for his hand. "Don't, Charles," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "You'll only upset yourself." Her red lips curved in a smile, but her green eyes were cool, and Miss Marple noted how her fingers barely touched Charles's before pulling away. Vincent cleared his throat, lighting a cigarette. "It's got to be an outsider," he said, exhaling smoke. "Some thief, maybe, after the manor's silver." His tone was casual, but his eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting trouble. Clara said nothing, her handkerchief now a tight knot in her hands. Miss Marple watched her, noting the ring on her finger too fine for a governess, glinting faintly in the dim light. She thought of a St. Mary Mead maid who'd worn a stolen bracelet, her guilt plain in her nervous glances. Was Clara hiding something similar? The interviews began, and Beatrice returned after 20 minutes, her face paler than before. He asked about Reginald. She whispered to Miss Marple, sinking into her chair. When I last saw him, what we talked about. I told him dinner. Then he went to his study. Oh, Jane, it's so awful. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple patted her hand. Her touch gentle, but her eyes sharp. Charles Harrow, Crane called next, and Charles stood, his face flushed. He glanced at Diana, then strode out, his steps heavy. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her ears tuned to the murmurs from the parlour. She couldn't hear words, but Charles's voice rose once, sharp and defensive, before falling silent. When Charles returned, his face was red, his hands clenched. He thinks I did it, he muttered, sitting heavily. Because of the inheritance. It's nonsense. Diana touched his arm, but her expression was unreadable, and Miss Marple noted the slight frown Vincent hid behind his cigarette. Diana Voss. Crane called, and Diana rose, her silk dress rustling. She moved with grace, but Miss Marple saw her pause at the door, her hand brushing her hair as if steadying herself. In St. Mary Mead, a young woman had done the same before, lying about a stolen purse. Her nerves betraying her, the breakfast table grew quieter, the clink of cups, the only sound. Vincent tried to lighten the mood, joking about the weather, but no one responded. Clara stared at her plate, her fingers twisting her ring now, not her handkerchief. Miss Marple watched, her mind ticking. That ring, where had it come from? A gift, a keepsake, or something stolen? She thought of a village boy who'd given his sweetheart a ring, only for it to belong to his mother, sparking a scandal. Charles leaned toward Beatrice, his voice low. Aunt, what did you tell Crane? About me and Uncle. Beatrice flinched, her eyes darting to Miss Marple. Just the truth, Charles, that you and Reginald argued sometimes, about the wedding, the money. Her voice faded, and she looked away. Charles's jaw tightened. It wasn't serious, just family stuff. But his voice shook, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. Arguments over money, she knew, could turn deadly. In St. Mary Mead, a farmer had struck his brother over a debt, leaving a bruise that told the tale. Diana returned, her face calm but her eyes sharp. He's thorough, that inspector, she said, sitting beside Charles. Wanted to know where I was last night. I told him, sound asleep until the scream. She smiled, but Miss Marple saw her fingers tap the table. A tiny sign of nerves. Vincent Lyle, Crane called, and Vincent stubbed out his cigarette, his grin back in place. My turn to face the music, he said, winking at Diana before heading to the parlour. Miss Marple watched him go, recalling his whispered talk of debts. Was he involved, or just a distraction, like the village gossip who'd spread rumours to hide his own theft? Clara was called next, and she stood slowly, her handkerchief falling to the floor. Miss Marple bent to pick it up, noting a faint monogramma, H. Reginald Harrow. Curious, she thought, handing it back with a smile. Clara mumbled thanks, her face flushing, and hurried out. Miss Marple's mind turned to a St. Mary Mead widow who'd kept a dead man's watch, claiming it was a gift. Keepsakes could hide guilt. With only Beatrice, Charles, and Diana left, the silence grew heavy. Beatrice dabbed her eyes, murmuring about Reginald's love for the manor. He wanted it to stay in the family, she said. Hated the idea of Charles selling any part of it? Charles flushed. I'd never sell it, Aunt. You know that. But his voice was strained, and Miss Marple wondered what pressures weighed on him, love, money, or both. Diana sighed, brushing a curl from her face. This is all so tiresome. Can't they find a thief and be done with it? Her tone was light, but Miss Marple saw her glance at the door, as if expecting Vincent's return. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice like a breeze. Thieves are one thing, my dear, but murder takes planning or passion. In my village, a man once broke a window in a rage, thinking no one saw, but someone always sees. Her eyes twinkled, and Diana's smile froze, just for a moment. Vincent returned, his face smooth, but his eyes guarded. Crane's a tough one, he said, lighting another cigarette. Asked about my business, my ties to Charles, as if I'd stab a man over a bad deal. He laughed, but it sounded forced, and Miss Marple noted his quick glance at Diana. Clara came back last, her eyes red, her hands shaking. She sat without a word, her ring hidden now, her fingers clasped tightly. Miss Marple watched, her mind weaving. Clara's nerves, the monogrammed handkerchief, the ring's small threads. But they tugged at something larger. Crane entered, his face grim. I've got your statements, but we're not done. The study's locked tight, no forced entry, no footprints outside, though the ground's soft from rain. The letter opener was from the desk, not carried in. This was no random thief. His eyes swept the group, lingering on Charles. Charles stood, his voice loud. You're wrong, Inspector. I loved my uncle, even if we argued. Ask anyone. He looked at Diana, but she only nodded, her expression cool. Crane raised a hand. We'll check alibis and search the house. For now, stay put. He turned to Miss Marple, his eyes narrowing. You've been quiet, Miss Marple. Seen anything I should know? Oh, I'm just an old lady, Inspector, she said, her voice mild. But I did notice a scent in the study perfume, perhaps, and the window-sill had a smudge, though it was locked. Odd, isn't it? She smiled, her words light but pointed. Crane nodded, scribbling in his notebook. We'll look into it. Stay here, all of you. He left with Trotter, their boots echoing in the hall. The group sat in silence, the air thick with suspicion. Beatrice whispered to Miss Marple, Jane, you always see things. What do you think? I think, Miss Marple said, her voice soft, that people hide things like shadows behind a curtain. In St. Mary Mead, a girl once hid a letter that told her secret. We just need to find the right shadow. Her eyes moved over the group. Charles's anger, Diana's calm, Vincent's smirk, Clara's fear. The morning dragged on, the guests. Restless, Charles paced, muttering about the inheritance. Diana read a magazine, her fingers tapping. Vincent smoked, his eyes on the door. Clara sat still, her hands clasped, but Miss Marple saw her glance at the window, as if expecting something or someone. She thought of the perfume, so like Diana's, but Clara had been near the study too. The smudge on the sill. Had someone tampered with the lock, or was it a trick to confuse? And the letter opener, taken from the descanger or planning. In St. Mary Mead, a shopkeeper had been struck with his own ledger, a crime of impulse. Here the truth was murkier. As lunch was served cold, meats and bread, barely touched, Miss Marple spoke to Beatrice, her voice low. Tell me about Reginald's will. Was Charles to inherit everything? Beatrice hesitated, her eyes darting. To Charles, Most of it, yes. The manor, the land. But Reginald was strict, wanted Charles to settle down, not waste money. They argued about Diana, too. Reginald thought her unsuitable. Her voice dropped, and Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning. An unsuitable fiancé, a disputed will, whispered debts, motives were piling up like leaves. She thought of Clara's ring again, and the handkerchief with R.H. Was it Reginald's, or a coincidence? In St. Mary Mead, a monogrammed scarf had led to a thief's downfall. The initials, a careless clue. The day stretched on, the manor quiet, but tense. Crane and Trotter searched the grounds, finding no footprints, but confirming the window's lock was intact. Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room fire, her knitting in her lap, her eyes on the guests. Charles argued with Diana in whispers, his voice sharp. Vincent offered Clara a cigarette, which she refused, her hands shaking. Beatrice dozed, exhausted by grief. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to St. Mary Mead, where a locked room had hidden a secret affair, revealed by a single hairpin. Here, the locked study held its own secret's perfume, a smudge, a letter opener, and the guests, each with their shadows. Charles, angry over money. Diana, to calm, perhaps hiding something. Vincent, with his talk of debts. Clara, nervous and secretive, her ring a puzzle. As evening fell, Crane returned, his face set. "We'll continue tomorrow," he said. "No one leaves." Miss Marple, a word. He gestured to the parlour, and she followed. Her steps slow but steady. "You've got a sharp eye," he said, closing the door. "That perfume, you're sure?" "Quite sure," Miss Marple said. "Sweet, like roses, but sharp. And the smudge, it's small, but there. Windows can be tricky, Inspector. In my village, a locked door wasn't always locked, if you knew the trick." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were keen. Crane nodded, his pen pausing. "You think someone in the house did this?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that people act for reasons, love, money, fear. You just have to find the reason." She smiled, her words light but heavy with meaning. Back in the drawing-room, the guests were silent, their eyes avoiding each other. Miss Marple sat, her knitting needles clicking, her mind weaving. The shadow of motive was growing, and she was determined to find its source, one clue at a time. Chapter 5. The clue in the garden. The morning sun hung low over Willow Manor, casting a pale light across the gardens. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading roses. Miss Jane Marple stood at her bedroom window, her grey shawl draped over her shoulders, her white hair neatly tucked under a scarf. Below, the flower beds stretched in neat rows, their colours muted in the October chill. But her sharp blue eyes lingered on a patch near the house where stems were bent, and petals scattered, as if someone had trodden carelessly. She'd noticed it yesterday, arriving in the dusk, and now in the clear light. It called to her like a dropped stitch in her knitting. Sir Reginald Harrow's murder the night before, stabbed in his locked study with an antique letter opener, left the manor in a fog of fear. The guests were restless. Charles Harrow, the nephew, angry and defensive. Diana Voss, his fiancée, calm but calculating. Vincent Lyle, the slick businessman, hiding something behind his charm. And Clara, the governess, nervous and secretive, her ring and monogrammed handkerchief tugging at Miss Marple's thoughts. Inspector Crane and Sergeant Trotter were still questioning, searching for answers. But Miss Marple knew the truth often lay in small things others overlooked. She slipped on her sturdy shoes and a warm coat, deciding a walk in the garden might clear her mind. Downstairs, the dining room was quiet, the breakfast trays barely touched. Beatrice Harrow, pale and weary, sat alone, her hands clasped around a cold cup of tea. "Jane, you're up early," she said, her voice faint. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little, dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "But a walk in your lovely garden might do me good. Fresh air helps one think." She smiled, but her eyes noted Beatrice's trembling fingers and the dark circles under her eyes. "Grief, yes, but perhaps fear, too." Beatrice nodded. "The roses are still blooming. Reginald loved them so." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Marple patted her hand. "I'll be back soon. Try to rest, Beatrice." She stepped into the hall, where a maid was sweeping, her movements quick and nervous. The girl glanced up, then away, and Miss Marple noted her pale face, fearful like Clara's, in St. Mary. Mead, a nervous maid, had once hidden a stolen brooch, her guilt plain in her eyes. Small signs, Miss Marple thought, always told a story. Outside, the garden was a maze of neat paths and trimmed hedges, the roses still bright despite the season. Miss Marple walked slowly, her hands clasped behind her, her eyes scanning the ground. The trampled patch was near the study window, just below the stone wall of the manor. She knelt, her knees creaking, and studied the damage. The soil was soft from recent rain, and among the broken stems, she saw small footprints too small for a man's, she thought, and fresh, the edges sharp in the mud. A woman's shoe, perhaps, or a boy's. She glanced at the window above. Its latch still locked, the smudge she'd noticed last night barely visible in the daylight. She stood, brushing dirt from her coat, and moved closer to the window. The sill was high, but not impossible to reach. The smudge was faint, a smear of something grease perhaps, or a glove's mark. She thought of a St. Mary Mead burglary, where a smudge on a window had led to a thief who'd used wax to ease a latch. Was this a trick to make the murder seem impossible, or had someone climbed through? The locked window suggested no outsider. But Miss Marple knew locks could be fooled. As she turned back to the flower bed, a glint caught her ajar scrap of paper, caught in a rosebush's thorns. She plucked it carefully, her fingers nimble despite her age. It was torn, no bigger than a postcard, with ink smudged but readable. "Meet me at midnight." The handwriting was hurried, the paper cheap, not like the manor's fine stationery. She tucked it into her pocket, her mind racing. A note, left carelessly, could mean everything. In St. Mary Mead, a torn letter had revealed a secret affair. The writer caught by her own words. She continued her walk, circling the manor, her eyes sharp. The garden was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and a distant bird. But as she neared the back terrace, she heard voices low, urgent, coming from an open window in the drawing room. She paused, hidden by a tall hedge, her ears tuned like a radio. "Can't keep this up," a man's voice said, sharp and tense. "Charles," she thought, his tone raw with worry. "If they find out," quiet, a woman's voice hissed Diana, her words like a whip. "You'll ruin everything. Just act normal." A pause, then softer. "You know what's at stake." Miss Marple held her breath, her heart steady. Act normal, words that hid secrets. In St. Mary Mead, a shopkeeper had told his wife to act normal before they were caught selling stolen goods. She waited, but the voices stopped, replaced by the clink of a cup. She moved on, her steps silent, her mind weaving the note, the footprints, and the whispers into a pattern. Back inside, the drawing room was tense. Charles stood by the window, his face flushed, staring at the garden. Diana sat reading a magazine, her posture perfect but her fingers tapping. Vincent was absent, likely with Crane, and Clara sat in a corner, her hands twisting her handkerchief, one with RH stitched in the corner. Beatrice looked up as Miss Marple entered, her face brightening. "Jane, was the garden nice?" "Lovely," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair, "though some roses have suffered." "A trampled bed." "Near the study. Careless feet, I suppose." Her voice was mild, but her eyes flicked to Clara, who froze, her handkerchief dropping to her lap. "Oh, those gardeners," Beatrice said, sighing. "They're not as careful as they should be." But her voice wavered, and Miss Marple wondered if she suspected more. Inspector Crane entered, his notebook open, Sergeant Trotter behind him. "We've searched the grounds," Crane said. "No signs of an outsider, no footprints, no broken locks. The murder happened inside, I'm sure of it." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Charles, who looked away. Miss Marple spoke softly, her tone gentle. "The window, Inspector. Did you check the sill? There's a smudge, quite faint, and the flower bed below is trampled with small footprints." She smiled, as if mentioning a stray cat, but her words landed like stones. Crane's eyes narrowed. "Footprints. We saw none. The grounds soft but clean." He scribbled a note, then glanced at Trotter. "Check again, Sergeant, and the sill look closely." Trotter nodded and left, his boots loud on the floor. Miss Marple watched the guests. Charles's flush deepened. Diana's fingers paused. Clara's hands shook. Vincent entered then, his grin in place but his eyes guarded. "Missed me, did you?" he said, lighting a cigarette. "Crane's got me pegged as a crook, I swear." "Don't be silly," Diana said, her voice light, but sharp. "He's just doing his job." She glanced at Miss Marple, her smile tight, and Miss Marple noted the faint scent of her perfume roses, sharp, like the study's air. The day dragged on, the manor heavy with suspicion. Crane called Charles for another interview, his questions sharper now. "You argued with your uncle," Miss Marple overheard as she passed the parlour, "about money, the wedding. Care to explain?" "It was nothing," Charles snapped. "Family stuff. He didn't like Diana, thought she was after the manor, but I'd never." His voice broke, and Miss Marple moved on, her mind ticking. An argument over money, a fiancé disapproved of old motives. As common as weeds. At lunch, a cold spread of sandwiches and fruit, the guests were silent. Beatrice tried to talk about the weather, but no one joined in. Clara barely ate, her eyes on her lap, her ring hidden now. Miss Marple spoke to her, her voice kind. "Clara, dear, you must be tired with all this upset. Do you walk in the garden much? It's so calming." Clara flinched, her voice faint. "Not much, ma'am. I stay inside, mostly." Her hands twisted, and Miss Marple saw the ring again, its stone catching the light. Too fine, she thought, for a governess's wage. In St. Mary Mead, a girl had worn a stolen ring, her guilt plain in her nervous hands. Miss Marple smiled, changing the subject. "Your young Tommy must love the gardens when he's home. Boys do love to explore." "He does," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "But he's at school now." She looked away, and Miss Marple filed the detail away, like a stitch in her pattern. After lunch, Crane gathered the guests in the drawing room. "We've found no new evidence," he said, his voice grim. but the letter opener was from the desk, and the window's lock is intact. Someone in this house knows more than they're saying. His eyes lingered on Charles, then Diana, then Vincent. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting in her lap, her eyes soft but sharp. The note in her pocket, "Meet me at midnight," burned in her thoughts. Was it meant for Reginald? Had he met his killer in the study? And the footprints, small and fresh. Diana's shoes were dainty, but so were Clara's. She thought of Vincent's whispered debts, Charles's argument, Diana's calm. Each guest had a shadow, and she meant to find which hid the truth as evening fell. Beatrice invited Miss Marple to tea in her private sitting room. "Jane, I'm so frightened," Beatrice said, pouring tea with shaky hands. "Reginald Wiltshire gets the manor, but only if he marries sensibly." Reginald's words, not mine. He thought Diana was trouble. Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. "Families are tricky, Beatrice. In St. Mary Mead, a father once cut his son from his will over a bad match. It led to shouting, but never murder. Still, money and love make people act strangely." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes watched Beatrice's face, seeing the worry deepen. "Diana's charming," Beatrice said, "but Reginald said she was after Charles's money, and Charles, he's so in love, he won't hear it." She paused, her voice dropping. "And Clara, she's been odd lately, nervous, like she's hiding something." Miss Marple's ears pricked. "Clara, she's young, perhaps just shaken by the murder." But her mind turned to the handkerchief, the ring, the footprints. Was Clara more than a frightened governess? Back in the drawing room, the guests were tense. Charles paced, Diana read, Vincent smoked, Clara sat still, her eyes down. Miss Marple took her knitting, her needles clicking, her mind weaving. The note, the footprints, the smudge, the perfume's small clues, but they pointed somewhere. In St. Mary Mead, a torn note had led to a thief's confession, the paper's ink matching his pen. Here, the truth was closer, hidden in the manor's shadows. As night fell, Crane posted Trotter at the hall, his voice firm. "No one leaves. We'll search the rooms tomorrow." The guests nodded, their faces tight, and Miss Marple climbed to her room, her steps slow but her mind racing. She sat by the window, the garden dark below, the trampled flower bed a faint outline. The note. In her pocket, the footprints, the whispers. She was close, she knew, to unraveling the thread that would lead to the killer. Chapter 6. A village parallel. The second day at Willow Manor dawned grey and heavy, the sky thick with clouds that promised rain. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a half-finished scarf in her lap. Her grey dress was neat, her brooch pinned precisely, but her blue eyes were sharp, scanning the room with the quiet focus of a cat watching a bird. The murder of Sir Reginald Harrowstab in his locked study with an antique letter opener had cast a shadow over the house. The guests were restless. Charles Harrow, the nephew, sat with his head in his hands. Diana Voss, his fiancée, flipped through a magazine, her calm unnatural. Vincent Lyle, the businessman, smoked by the window, his grin gone. And Clara, the governess, huddled in a corner, her hands twisting her handkerchief, the one with RH stitched in the corner. Miss Marple's mind was busy, weaving the clues she'd gathered, the trampled flower bed, the smudge on the study windows, sill, the scent of perfume, the torn note saying "Meet me at midnight." Vincent's whispered talk of debts, Clara's fine ring, and Charles's argument with his uncle over money and Diana. Each was a thread in a pattern not yet clear, but forming she thought of St. Mary Mead, her village, where small Cluser dropped letter. A nervous glance had often unravelled big secrets. Here, at Willow Manor, the stakes were higher, but people, she knew, were much the same. Inspector Crane and Sergeant Trotter were upstairs, searching the guests' rooms, their boots echoing in the quiet house. Beatrice Harrow, pale and weary, sat across from Miss Marple, sipping tea that had gone cold. "Jane, I can't bear this," she whispered, her hands trembling. "Reginald gone, and now the police, suspecting Charles. It's too much." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice gentle. "It's dreadful, Beatrice, but the truth will come out. It always does, like weeds in a garden. You just have to look closely." Her eyes flicked to Clara, who flinched, as if the words were aimed at her. Beatrice nodded, her eyes red. Charles loved Reginald, even if they argued. It was just about the will and Diana. Reginald thought she was not right for him. She lowered her voice, glancing at Diana, who was absorbed in her magazine, or pretending to be. Miss Marple's ears pricked. "Not right. In what way, dear?" Her tone was mild, but her mind was sharp, filing away every word. Beatrice hesitated. "He said she was after Charles's money. Called her a gold digger. Oh, Jane, I don't believe it, but Reginald was so stubborn." She dabbed her eyes, her shawl slipping. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to a St. Mary Mead case, years ago, that felt like a mirror to this one. A young man, Tom Barker, had been accused of stealing from his uncle's shop, all because of a girl he loved, Elsie, who wanted fine things. The uncle had died suddenly, poisoned, and Tom was blamed, his motive tied to money and Elsie's demands. But Miss Marple had noticed small things: smudged window, a torn note. Elsie's nervous hand found the truth. Elsie's brother, not Tom, had done it, driven by greed. The parallel was striking. Charles, like Tom, was under suspicion. His love for Diana a shadow over him. But was Diana the motive, or was someone else hiding in the shadows? She glanced at Clara, whose hands were busy with her handkerchief, the ring on her finger catching the light. It was too fine for a governess, Miss Marple thought, and the monogrammer H-nagged at her. Was it Reginald's, a gift or something? Stolen. In St. Mary Mead, a maid had kept a dead man's watch, claiming it was hers, but her nerves had given her away. Clara's nerves were plain, her face pale, her eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple set her knitting down and rose, her steps slow but purposeful. "I think I'll stretch my legs, Beatrice," she said. "Perhaps Clara could show me the library. I'd love a book to pass the time." Her smile was warm, but her eyes were on Clara, who froze, her handkerchief dropping to her lap. Of course, Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice barely audible. She stood, her grey dress plain but neat, her hands shaking slightly. Miss Marple noted the ring again, its stone glinting a sapphire, perhaps too costly for her wages. They walked to the library, a dim room with tall shelves and a musty smell of old books. Clara moved stiffly, her eyes on the floor. Miss Marple chatted lightly, her voice like a breeze. "You must know this house well, Clara, being here so long. 5 years, you said." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said, her voice soft. "Since Tommy was small, I'd look after him and the house when needed." She paused by a shelf, her fingers brushing a book but not pulling it out. "It's a grand place," Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the room. A ladder stood in the corner, leading to higher shelves, and a door led to the garden, its latch old but firm. All these rooms and passage easy to get lost, I imagine, or to slip about unnoticed. Her tone was gentle, but Clara's hands twitched, and she looked away. I suppose, Clara said, her voice faint, I stick to my duties, mostly. Miss Marple nodded, her mind ticking. Clara knew the Manor's layout passages, doors, perhaps even tricks with windows. In St. Mary Mead, a gardener had known every path in the village, using one to sneak into a shed and steal tools. Knowledge was power, and Clara's nerves suggested she knew more than she said. She picked a book from the shelf, a gardening guide. Fitting for her cover, Story Ann smiled at Clara. You're so young to be so responsible, dear. It must be hard, alone in a big house like this. No family of your own. Clara's face flushed, her fingers twisting the ring. No, ma'am. I'm an orphan. The Harrows have been kind to me. Her voice shook, and Miss Marple saw her glance at the garden door, as if it held answers or escape. Kindness is a blessing, Miss Marple said, her tone warm. In my village, a girl like you, all alone, took comfort in small things, a ring, perhaps, or a keepsake. But keepsakes can carry stories, can't they? Her eyes twinkled, and Clara's hand froze, covering the ring. I should check on the maids, Clara said, her voice high. She hurried out, leaving Miss Marple alone in the library, her mind weaving the ring, the handkerchief, Clara's knowledge of the house small threads, but they tugged at something larger. Miss Marple thought again of the St. Mary Mead case. Elsie's brother had poisoned Tom's uncle, using a hidden vial in the shop. His motive, greed, but his method, clever. A locked door, a smudged window, a note to lure the victim. The parallels were uncanny. A locked study, a smudge, a note saying meet me at midnight. Was Clara the key, or a distraction, like Elsie had been? Back in the drawing room, the guests were tense. Charles paced, his face red. Crane's got it in for me, he muttered. Keeps asking about the will, like I'd kill for it. Diana touched his arm, her voice soothing, but her eyes were cool, watching Vincent, who smoked silently. Beatrice looked up as Miss Marple entered. Jane, did you find a book? Her voice was weary, her hands clutching her shawl. Yes, dear, Miss Marple said, holding up the gardening guide. Something to keep me busy. She sat, her knitting resumed, her eyes on Clara, who'd returned and was now dusting a table. Her movements jerky. Inspector Crane entered, his notebook open. We've searched the rooms, he said, his voice grim. Nothing yet, but the study's still our focus. The letter opener was from the desk. No fingerprints but the victim's. Whoever did this was careful. His eyes lingered on Charles. Who flushed? I told you, I was asleep. Charles said, his voice loud. Asked Diana, she was with me until we heard the scream. Diana nodded, her smile tight. It's true, Inspector. We were together. But Miss Marple saw her fingers tap her knee, a sign of nerves, and recalled the perfume in the study so like Diana's, but Clara had been near the study to Dot. Crane turned to Vincent. And you, Mr. Lyle, you said you were smoking in your room. Anyone see you? Vincent shrugged, exhaling smoke. Just me and my cigarette, Inspector. I heard the scream and came down. His tone was light, but Miss Marple saw his eyes flick to Diana, then away. Clara was last, her voice barely audible. I was reading, Inspector. In my room, I didn't see anything. Her hands shook, and Miss Marple noted the ring again, hidden now under her sleeve. Crane nodded, scribbling. "We'll keep looking. The grounds are clear, but Miss Marple's footprints, small ones, near the study need checking, and that smudge on the sill." He glanced at her, his eyes sharp. "You've got a keen eye, Miss Marple." "Oh, I just notice things," she said, her voice mild. "In St. Mary Mead, a smudge led to a thief, and a note to a liar. Small things add up." Her smile was gentle, but her words landed, and Clara's face paled. The day wore on, the manor quiet but tense. Lunch was a silent affair, the guests picking at their food. Miss Marple spoke to Beatrice, her voice low. "Clara's an orphan, you said. Has she always been so nervous?" Beatrice frowned, her voice soft. "Not always. She's been jumpy lately, since Reginald started talking about the will. She's fond of Tommy, you know, almost like a sister." She paused, her eyes worried. "Do you think she's hiding something, Jane?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that everyone hides something, even if it's just fear. In St. Mary Mead, a nervous girl hid a secret that broke a family. We'll see." Her tone was kind, but her mind was sharp, weaving Clara's nerves, the ring, the handkerchief, and the footprints into a pattern. As evening fell, Crane gathered the guests again. "We're checking alibis," he said, "but someone's not telling the truth. The study was locked, the weapon from inside. This was no outsider." His eyes swept the room, and Charles shifted, his face red dot. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting, needles clicking, her mind racing. The St. Mary Mead case haunted Hurtham. Elsie, the poisoned uncle, the smudged window, the note. Here, the clues were similar, but the truth was deeper, hidden in the manor's shadows. Clara's ring, the note, the footprints. Someone had met Reginald at midnight, and she meant to find out who. Chapter 7. The second tragedy. The afternoon at Willow Manor was heavy with unease. The air thick as if a storm were brewing, though the sky remained grey and still. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly. A half-finished scarf draped across her lap. Her grey dress was neat, her brooch pinned precisely, but her blue eyes were sharp, scanning the guests with the quiet focus of a gardener spotting weeds. The murder of Sir Reginald, Harrow stabbed in his locked study with an antique letter opener, had left the house in a state of shock. But Miss Marple knew trouble rarely came alone. Her mind wove the clues she'd gathered, the trampled flower bed, the smudged windowsill, the scent of perfume, the torn note saying "Meet me at midnight," Vincent Lyle's whispered talk of debts, Clara's fine ring, and Charles Harrow's argument with his uncle over money and his fiancée, Diana Voss. Each was a thread, and she sensed the pattern was about to grow darker. The guests were scattered around the room, their faces pale and tense. Charles sat by the window, staring at the garden, his hands clenched. Diana Voss, his fiancée, sipped tea, her red lips calm but her green eyes watchful. Vincent Lyle leaned against the fireplace, smoking a cigarette, his usual charm dimmed. Clara, the governess, sat in a corner, her hands twisting her handkerchief, the one with RH stitched in the corner, her ring hidden under her sleeve. Lady Beatrice Harrow, exhausted from grief, dozed in an armchair, her shawl slipping. Inspector Crane and Sergeant Trotter were upstairs, still searching rooms, their footsteps echoing faintly through the manor. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to St. Mary Mead, her village, where a single crime often led to another, like ripples. In a pond, years ago, a theft at the vicarage had uncovered a poisoning, the thief desperate to hide his tracks. She wondered if Sir Reginald's killer feared exposure, their secrets tied to the manor's wealth or its family. The note to meet me at midnight suggested a planned meeting, but the small footprints in the garden and Clara's nervous ring hinted at something deeper, perhaps a betrayal or a hidden past. The quiet was shattered by a piercing cry from upstairs, sharp and desperate, like the scream that had woken the house the night before. Charles leaped to his feet, his face white. "That's Diana," he shouted, racing for the stairs. Vincent dropped his cigarette, following close behind. Clara gasped, her handkerchief falling, and Beatrice woke with a start, her eyes wide. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but steady, her knitting set aside. Her heart was calm, but her mind raced, sensing the storm had broken. They reached the upstairs hall, where a maid stood by Diana's door, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. She's not moving," the maid stammered, pointing inside. Charles pushed past, his voice hoarse. "Diana, Diana." Miss Marple followed, her eyes sharp, taking in the scene. Diana lay on her bed, her silk robe crumpled, her golden hair fanned across the pillow. Her face was pale, her lips faintly blue, and her hand clutched a wineglass, its contents spilled on the quilt. The air held a sharp, bitter scent not. Perfume this time, but something chemical, like almonds. Miss Marple's mind flashed to St. Mary Mead, where a farmer's wife had died from cyanide in her tea, her death mistaken for a heart attack until the smell gave it away. Charles knelt by the bed, shaking Diana's shoulder. "Wake up, darling, please." His voice broke, and Vincent pulled him back, his face grim. "Don't touch her," Vincent said, his voice low. "She's gone, Charles. We need the police." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, who stood quietly, her hands clasped, her gaze sweeping the room. Beatrice clutched Miss Marple's arm, her voice trembling. "Jane, not again. First Reginald, now Diana. What's happening?" Her face was ashen, her hands shaking. Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice gentle. "It's dreadful, Beatrice, but we must stay calm. The truth will show itself, like a weed in the grass." Her eyes noted the wineglass, the spilled liquid, and a faint smear on Diana's fingers, as if she'd gripped something tightly. The window was open, a breeze stirring the curtains, but the sill was clean. Unlike the studies, Clara stood by the door, her hands pressed to her chest, her face ghostly white. "It's too horrible," she whispered, her ring glinting as her sleeve slipped. Miss Marple watched her, recalling the nervous maid in St. Mary Mead who'd hidden poison in a pantry, her guilt plain in her trembling hands. Inspector Crane burst in, Sergeant Trotter behind him, their faces set. "What's happened?" Crane demanded, his notebook already open. Charles, still kneeling, looked up, his eyes red. "She's dead," he choked out. "Poisoned, I think. That smell, it's not right." Crane knelt by the bed, sniffing the air. "Cyanide," he said grimly. "Trotter, get the doctor from Danbury, and seal this room no one touches anything." He stood, his eyes sweeping the group, who saw her last. Charles shook his head, his voice hoarse. "We were in the drawing room, all of us. She said she was tired, went to rest. That was an hour ago." He looked at Vincent, who nodded. "Double quotes about then," Vincent said, his tone steady but his eyes guarded. "I stayed downstairs, smoking. Didn't see her after." Clara whispered, "I was dusting in the library. I didn't." Her voice faded, and she looked away, her hands twisting. Beatrice sobbed. She was fine at lunch. So bright, so lively. Oh, Jane, who's doing this? Miss Marple said nothing, her mind racing. Cyanide quick, deadly, not easily found. In St. Mary Mead, the farmer's wife's poison had come from a shed used for pests. Where had this come from? She stepped closer, her eyes on the wineglass. The decanter on a side table was half full, its dark liquid glinting. Was this wine shared? She asked, her voice mild. Crane glanced at her, his eyes sharp. Good question, Charles. Was this decanter used at lunch? Charles nodded, his face dazed. Yes, we all had some. It was on the table, but no one else is sick. His voice rose, and Miss Marple saw his hands shake, his grief raw, but his fear deeper. Crane scribbled in his notebook. We'll test the decanter. If it's poisoned, it could have been meant for anyone, or meant to look that way. His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, as if recognizing her knack for seeing what others missed. The doctor arrived, a thin man with a grim face, confirming cyanide poisoning. She was dead within minutes, he said, packing his bag. The wine's the likely source. I'll send samples to the lab. Crane nodded, ordering Trotter to secure the decanter and glass. Miss Marple watched the guests, her face calm, but her mind, like her knitting needles, looping clues. The shared decanter suggested a reckless killer, or a clever one, masking their target. Diana's calm at lunch. Her quick exit, her blue lips. Now had she been the intended victim, or a mistake? She thought of the St. Mary Mead poisoning, where the wrong person drank from a shared pot. The killer's plan undone by chance. Crane gathered the guests in the drawing room, his voice firm. 2 murders in 2 days. Sir Reginald stabbed in a locked room. Now Miss Voss poisoned with cyanide. Someone in this house is responsible, and I'll find them. His eyes lingered on Charles, who flinched, his face red. I didn't do this, Charles shouted. I loved Diana and Uncle. Reginald died, never hurt them. His voice broke, and he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Vincent lit another cigarette, his hands steady but his eyes sharp. Easy, Charles. The inspector's just doing his job. But poison, that's a nasty business. Takes planning. He glanced at Miss Marple as if testing her reaction. Clara said nothing, her handkerchief crumpled, her ring hidden again. Miss Marple watched her, noting her silence, her pale face. In St. Mary Mead, silence had often hidden guilt, like the maidhood said nothing but knew everything. Beatrice clutched Miss Marple's arm. Jane, this is madness. First Reginald, now Diana. Are we all in danger? Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her eyes soft but keen. We must be careful, Beatrice, she said, but the truth comes out, like a stain you can't scrub away. In my village, a second crime often showed the first's motive. Her words were gentle, but her mind turned to the cyanide. Where had it come from? A shed, a cellar, a hidden vial. Crane sent the guests to their rooms, posting Trotter at the hall. No one moves until we search again, he said. We're looking for cyanide, any trace of it. He glanced at Miss Marple, his eyes narrowing. You've got a sharp mind, Miss Marple. Seen anything else? Just small things, Inspector, she said, her voice mild. The decanter was shared, but Diana's glass was in her room. And that smells cyanide's distinct, isn't it? Like almonds, but bitter. She smiled, but her words were pointed, and Crane nodded, scribbling. Alone in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the garden dark below. The trampled flower bed, the note, the smudge, the perfume, the ring now a cyanide vial, somewhere in the house. She thought of the St. Mary Mead poisoning, where a vial had been hidden in a pantry, found only because a cat knocked it over. She rose, her steps slow, and slipped downstairs, her shawl wrapped tight. The library door was ajar, and she entered, her eyes sharp. The shelves were dim, but a glint caught her eye, small glass vial, tucked behind a book on poisons, of all things. She didn't touch it, knowing Crane would need it, but her heart quickened. Cyanide, hidden carelessly, or placed to be found. She thought of Vincent's debts, Clara's nerves, Charles's grief, Beatrice's fear. Someone was desperate, and desperation made mistakes. Back in her room, she sat, her knitting untouched, her mind weaving. 2 murders, 2 methods. Poisoning, a locked room, a shared decanter. The note, meet me at midnight, and now a vial. In St. Mary Mead, a second crime had revealed the first's truth, the killer's panic undoing their plan. Here, the truth was close, hidden in the manor's shadows, and Miss Marple was ready to pull the thread that would unravel it. Chapter 8. The Alibi Puzzle. The third day at Willow Manor dawned cold and grey, the clouds low and heavy, as if mourning the tragedies within. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a half-finished scarf draped across her lap. Her grey dress was neat, her brooch pinned precisely, but her blue eyes were sharp, scanning the guests with the quiet focus of a hawk watching a field. The murders of Sir Reginald, Harrow stabbed in his locked study with an antique letter opener and Diana Voss, poisoned with cyanide in her room, had plunged the house into a fog of fear and suspicion. The guests were frayed. Charles Harrow slumped in a chair, his face pale with grief. Vincent Lyle, smoking by the window, his charm brittle. Clara, the governess, twisting her handkerchief, her ring hidden under her sleeve. And Lady Beatrice Harrow, red-eyed and weary, clutching a cold cup of tea. Miss Marple's mind wove the clues she'd gathered, the trampled flower bed, the smudged windowsill, the scent of perfume in the study, the torn note saying meet me. At midnight, Vincent's whispered talk of debts, Clara's fine ring, the monogrammed handkerchief with R.H., and the cyanide vial hidden in the library. Each was a piece of a puzzle, and the second murder had made the picture murkier, like a storm cloud over St. Mary Mead. She thought of her village, where a double creamer theft followed by a poisoning had unravelled when a maid's alibi crumbled under scrutiny. Here, the alibis were shaky, and Miss Marple meant to find the crack. Inspector Crane entered, his square jaw set, his notebook open. Sergeant Trotter followed, his young face tense, carrying a tray of evidence bags. The wine glass, the decanter, the cyanide vial. "We've got the lab results," Crane said, his voice grim. The wine in Miss Voss's glass was laced with cyanide, but the decanter's clean. The poison was added to her glass alone. His eyes swept the room, lingering on Charles, who flinched her glass. Charles said, his voice hoarse, "But we all drank from the decanter at lunch." How could he? Stopped, his hands shaking, his eyes red with grief and fear. Crane nodded. Exactly. Someone targeted her, or made it look that way. "I need your alibis again, from lunch until the scream. Every minute counts." He glanced at Miss Marple, his eyes narrowing, as if sensing her quiet WATCHFULNESS. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her face calm but her mind racing. A clean decanter meant precision. A killer who knew Diana's habits, or who'd watched the table closely. She thought of a St. Mary Mead case, where a delayed poison in a teacup had killed a shopkeeper's wife, the killer slipping it in during a distraction. The timing here was key. When had the cyanide been added, and by whom? Crane started. With Charles, his pen poised. You said you were with Miss Voss after lunch. Then she went to her room. Where were you when she screamed? Charles rubbed his face, his voice low. I was in the billiard room, alone, thinking. I needed space after all this. He glanced at Beatrice, who nodded faintly, her hands trembling. Alone, Crane said, his tone sharp. No one saw you? Charles flushed. No, I was just there. Then I heard the scream and ran upstairs. His voice shook, and Miss Marple noted his clenched fists. His grief raw, but his story thin. Crane turned to Vincent, who stubbed out his cigarette, and, You, Mr. Lyle, you said you were smoking in your room last night, but after lunch? Same thing, Vincent said, his tone smooth but his eyes guarded. I was in the billiard room, too, earlier. Left before Charles, went to my room to read. Heard the scream and came down. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, and Miss Marple saw his fingers tap his thigh. A nervous habit. Crane's eyes narrowed. The billiard room's popular, it seems. No one saw you leave. Vincent shrugged. It's a big house, Inspector. People come and go. His voice was light, but Miss Marple recalled his whispered talk of debts. Wondering if his calm hid panic. Clara was next, her voice barely audible. I was in the library, dusting, after lunch. I stayed there until the scream. Her hands twisted her handkerchief, and Miss Marple saw the ring glint faintly, still out of place on a governess's finger. Crane scribbled, then frowned. The maid, Ellen, said she saw you near the library door, not inside, just before Miss Voss went upstairs. Care to explain? Clara's face went white, her hands shaking. I stepped out for air. The library gets stuffy. Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple's mind ticked. A maid's sighting could break an alibi, like in St. Mary Mead, when a grocer's boy was caught stealing because a neighbour saw him slip out a back door. Beatrice spoke last, her voice faint. I was in my sitting room, writing letters. I didn't see Diana after lunch. Oh, Inspector, it's too awful. She dabbed her eyes, and Miss Marple patted her hand, noting her genuine grief but also her nervous glance at Charles. Crane closed his notebook, his face grim. Your alibis are shaky. The billiard room, the library, your rooms, no one saw anyone, yet Miss Voss was poisoned. And Sir Reginald, stabbed in a locked room. Someone's lying. His eyes lingered on Charles, then Vincent, then Clara. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice like a breeze. Alibis are tricky, Inspector. In my village, a man swore he was asleep when a theft happened, but his muddy boots told another story. Timing matters, doesn't it? When was the poison put in the glass? Her eyes twinkled, but her words were pointed, and Crane nodded, scribbling. We're checking that, he said. The doctor says cyanide acts fast minutes, not hours. The glass was in her room, so it was likely poisoned after lunch, when she took it upstairs. He glanced at the group, his eyes sharp. Stay here. We're searching the library again, thanks to that vial. As Crane and Trotter left, the room fell silent, the air thick with suspicion. Charles paced, muttering, They think I did it. Me, I loved Diana. His voice broke, and he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Vincent lit another cigarette. His tone light but strained. Easy, Charles. They're grasping at straws. Poison's not your style. He glanced at Miss Marple, as if testing her, but she only smiled, her needles clicking. Clara sat still, her handkerchief a crumpled ball, her eyes on the floor. Miss Marple watched her, recalling the maid's sighting near the library. Clara's alibi was weak, and her ring too fine, perhaps stolen nagged at her. In St. Mary Mead, a weak alibi had led to a confession. The thief, caught by a single lie, was Clara hiding more than nerves? Beatrice looked at Miss Marple, her voice low. Jane, you always see things. Is it one of us? Her hands trembled, and Miss Marple patted them, her voice gentle. People hide things, Beatrice, she said, like shadows behind a curtain. In St. Mary Mead, a poisoner thought he was safe, but a delayed dose gave him away. We just need the right clue. Her eyes flicked to Clara, then Vincent, then Charles, each with their secrets. The day dragged on, the manor quiet but tense. Lunch was a cold spread, barely touched. Miss Marple spoke to Clara, her voice kind. You must know the library well. Dear, dusting there so often. All those books and cornices to hide something, isn't it? Her tone was light, but Clara's face paled, her hands shaking. I just glean, Clara said, her voice faint. I don't notice much, but her eyes darted to the door, and Miss Marple noted the lie. Small but clear. After lunch, Crane returned, his face grim. We found the vial in the library, behind a book on poisons. No fingerprints, but it's cyanide, same as in the glass. Someone knew where to hide it. His eyes swept the room, and Clara flinched, her handkerchief dropping. Miss Marple's mind raced. The vial, the note, the footprints, the perfume each pointed to a careful killer, or one panicking after the first crime. She thought of the St. Mary Mead poisoning, where a delayed dose had confused the timing, the killer caught by a spilled cup. Here, the clean decanter and the poisoned glass suggested a targeted act. But why Diana? Was she the goal or a mistake? To cover another motive. As evening fell, the guests gathered in the drawing room, their faces drawn. Charles sat alone, his grief heavy. Vincent smoked, his eyes sharp. Clara twisted her handkerchief, her ring glinting faintly. Beatrice dozed, exhausted. Miss Marple knitted, her needle steady, her mind weaving. The alibis were a puzzle, each guest's story, weak Charles alone, Vincent unseen, Clara missing, Beatrice distracted. In St. Mary Mead, a puzzle like this had broken when a witness spoke up, revealing a lie. Here, the maid's sighting of Clara was a crack, but not enough. Crane entered, his voice firm. We're checking the grounds again tomorrow. No one leaves. Miss Marple, a word. He gestured to the parlour, and she followed, her steps slow but steady. You've got a knack for this, Crane said, closing the door. That vial, you saw it before we did. Anything else? Miss Marple smiled, her voice mild. Just small things, Inspector. The maid saw Clara near the library, not in it. And the poison cyanide's quick, but it needs a moment to slip in. Someone watched Diana closely, or knew her habits. In my village, a poisoner was caught by a dropped spoon, left where it shouldn't be. Her words were gentle, but her eyes were keen. Crane nodded, scribbling. You think Clara's lying? I think, Miss Marple said, that nerves tell stories. We just need to listen. She smiled, leaving the parlor, her mind racing. The alibi puzzle was incomplete, but the pieces: Clara's ring, the vial, the note, the footprints were falling into place, and she was ready to find the truth. Chapter 9. The Hidden Letter. The fourth day at Willow Manor was cloaked in a damp mist. The gardens outside shrouded in grey, as if the house itself were hiding secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a half-finished scarf draped across her lap. Her grey dress was neat, her brooch pinned precisely, but her blue eyes were sharp, scanning the guests with the quiet focus of a seamstress threading a needle. The murders of Sir Reginald Harrow, stabbed in his locked study with an antique letter opener, and Diana Voss, poisoned with cyanide in her room, had left the manor in a state of dread. The guests were frayed. Charles Harrow, slumped in a chair, his face hollow with grief. Vincent Lyle, smoking by the window, his charm a thin mask. Clara, the governess, twisting her handkerchief, her ring glinting faintly. And Lady Beatrice Harrow, pale and weary, clutching a cold cup of tea. Miss Marple's mind wove the clues she'd gathered. The trampled flower bed, the smudged window-sill, the scent of perfume in the study, the torn note saying "Meet me at midnight," Vincent's whispered talk of debts, Clara's fine ring, the monogrammed handkerchief with R.H., the cyanide vial in the library, and the shaky alibis to Charles alone in the billiard room. Vincent unseen, Clara Meeson near the library, Beatrice distracted. Each was a thread in a tangled pattern, and the second murder had knotted it further. She thought of St. Mary Mead, her village, where a theft had led to a murder when a stolen ring exposed a blackmail scheme. The parallels were strong. Ring, Vincent's whispers, a hidden motive. Miss Marple knew the truth was close, waiting for the right tug to unravel it. The drawing-room was quiet, the air heavy with suspicion. Inspector Crane and Sergeant Trotter were upstairs, searching rooms again, their footsteps muffled but steady. Beatrice looked at Miss Marple, her eyes red. "Jane, I can't bear this," she whispered. "First Reginald, now Diana, are we cursed?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice gentle. "Not cursed, Beatrice, just caught in someone's secrets. In St. Mary Mead, a double crime unraveled when a hidden letter showed the truth. We just need to look closely." Her eyes flicked to Clara, whose hands froze, her handkerchief dropping to her lap. Charles stirred, his voice hoarse. "Crane's got it in for me. Thinks I killed them both. Gunkel for the money, Diana for I don't know what. It's madness." He rubbed his face, his eyes red with grief. Vincent exhaled smoke, his tone light but strained. "They're fishing, Charles. Poison's not your way, and a letter opener, too messy." He grinned, but his eyes were sharp, watching Miss Marple as if gauging her thoughts. Clara said nothing, her face pale, her ring hidden under her sleeve. Miss Marple noted her silence, recalling the St. Mary Mead case where a quiet maid had hidden a stolen ring, her guilt plain in her nervous hands. Clara's ring to fine for a governess nagged at her, and the monogrammed handkerchief with R.H. was another loose thread. Miss Marple set her knitting down, her voice soft. "Beatrice, dear, might I look in Diana's room? I'd like to see her things, perhaps something personal to remember her by." Her tone was kind, but her eyes were keen, knowing a victim's room often held secrets. Beatrice nodded, her voice faint. "Of course, Jane. The police are done there. I'll come with you." She rose, her shawl slipping, and Miss Marple followed, her steps slow but purposeful. The other guests watched, Charles with a frown, Vincent with a raised eyebrow, Clara with a quick glance away. Diana's room was on the second floor, its door ajar, the air still carrying a faint chemical temps. The bed was made, the spilled wineglass gone, but the side table held the decanter, now empty, taken for evidence. Beatrice stood by the window, her hands trembling. "It's so sad, Jane. She was so full of life." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room. The wardrobe held silk dresses, their colours bright like Diana's smile. A vanity was clotted with perfumes, one bottle matching the rose-scented air of the study. She opened a drawer, finding gloves and scarves, then moved to a small writing desk. "Did Diana write many letters?" she asked, her voice mild. "Not that I know," Beatrice said, her voice shaky. "She was always so busy planning the wedding." She dabbed her eyes, and Miss Marple patted her arm, her fingers brushing the desk's edge. Under a blotter, she felt a crinkle of paper tucked out of sight. She pulled it out carefully, a single sheet folded tightly. It was a letter, unsigned, in a sharp, slanted hand. "You know the deal. Pay up, or I tell Charles everything. V." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "V. Vincent," the letter hinted. At blackmail, tied to the debts she'd overheard. She slipped it into her pocket, beside the torn note from the garden. Her face calm, but her mind racing. "Poor Diana," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "She must have had her worries, like we all do." She glanced at Beatrice, who nodded, unaware of the find. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden letter had exposed a blackmailer, the writer caught by his own greed. Was Vincent pressing Diana, or was the letter a plant meant to mislead? They returned to the drawing room, where the guests sat in tense silence. Charles paced, muttering about Crane's questions. Vincent smoked, his eyes on the door. Clara twisted her handkerchief, her ring glinting faintly. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resumed, her mind weaving the new clue into the pattern, the letter, the note, the ring, the footprints each pointed to a web of secrets. With Vincent and Clara at its edges, Crane entered, his notebook open, his face grim. "We've checked the library again," he said. "No new evidence, but the vial was hidden deliberately behind a book on poisons, no less. Someone knew what they were doing." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Charles, then Vincent. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice like a breeze. "The library's an odd place for a vial, Inspector. So many books, so many corners. In my village, a poisoner hid a bottle in a pantry, but a cat knocked it over. Small things betray big plans." Her eyes twinkled, and Clara's hands froze, her face spelling. Crane nodded, scribbling. "We're testing the vial for prints, and the alibi's still full of holes. Mr. Harrow, you were alone in the billiard room. Mr. Lyle, same. Miss Clara, the maid, saw you outside the library, not in it. Lady Harrow, your letters don't account for every minute." He glanced at Miss Marple, as if expecting her to add something. She smiled, her voice mild. "Alibis are like knitting, Inspector. One drop stitch can unravel the whole piece. In St. Mary Mead, a man's alibi broke because a neighbour saw his shadow. Perhaps the maid saw more than she said." Her words were gentle, but Clara flinched, her handkerchief dropping. Crane's eyes narrowed. "The maid, Ellen, she's nervous, but we'll question her again. Miss Marple, you've got a sharp eye." He turned to the group. "Stay here. We're searching the grounds again tomorrow." The day dragged on, the manor heavy with tension. Lunch was a silent affair, the guests picking at their food. Miss Marple spoke to Clara, her voice kind. "You must know the manor well, dear, all its nooks and crannies. Easy to hide something, or to slip about unseen." Her tone was light, but Clara's face went white, her hands shaking. I just do my work," Clara said, her voice faint. "I don't wander." But her eyes darted to the window, and Miss Marple noted the lie. Small but clear. After lunch, Miss Marple sat with Beatrice, her voice low. "Tell me about Vincent, dear. He's a friend of Charles's, but he seems ambitious." Her eyes were soft, but her mind was on the letter, the V burning in her thoughts. Beatrice frowned, her voice soft. "He's in business investments, I think. Charles met him in London. Reginald didn't like him, said he was trouble, always talking about money." She paused, her eyes worried. "Do you think he's involved, Jane?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that money makes people act strangely. In St. Mary Mead, a blackmailer was caught by a letter, his greed, his downfall. We'll see." Her tone was gentle, but her mind wove the letter, the debts, and Clara's ring into a tighter pattern. As evening fell, the guests gathered in the drawing-room, their faces drawn. Charles sat alone, his grief heavy. Vincent smoked, his eyes sharp. Clara twisted her handkerchief, her ring glinting faintly. Beatrice dozed, exhausted. Miss Marple knitted, her needles steady, her mind racing. The hidden letter pointed to Vincent. But Clara's nerves, her ring, her presence near the library where they connected, or a distraction. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen ring had led to a blackmailer's confession, the thief caught by her own carelessness. Here, the truth was close, and Miss Marple was ready to find it, one clue at a time. Chapter 10. The Trap is Set. The 5th day at Willow Manor was cloaked in a chill mist. The gardens outside barely visible through the drawing-room's heavy curtains. Miss Jane Marple sat near the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, a half-finished scarf draped across her lap. Her grey dress was neat, her brooch pinned precisely, but her blue eyes were sharp, scanning the guests with the quiet focus of a chess player planning her next move. The murders of Sir Reginald Harrow stabbed in his locked study with an antique letter opener, and Diana Voss, poisoned with cyanide in her room, had left the manor steeped in fear and suspicion. The guests were frayed. Charles Harrow slumped in a chair, his face etched with grief. Vincent Lyle, smoking by the window, his charm fraying. Clara the governess, twisting her handkerchief, her ring glinting faintly. And Lady Beatrice Harrow, pale and weary, clutching a cold cup of tea. Miss Marple's mind wove the clues she'd gathered. The trampled flower bed, the smudged windowsill, the scent of perfume in the study, the torn note saying "Meet me at midnight," Vincent's whispered talk of debts, Clara's fine ring, the monogrammed handkerchief with RH, the cyanide vial in the library, and the hidden letter in Diana's room hinting at blackmail, signed with a V. The alibis were shaky Charles, alone in the billiard room, Vincent unseen, Clara Meeson near the library. Beatrice, distracted. Each clue was a thread, and Miss Marple sensed the pattern was close to revealing itself. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a staged trapper false clue about a stolen watch had flushed out a thief by making him panic. Here, she decided, a similar trap might shake loose the truth. The drawing-room was quiet, the air thick with tension. Inspector Crane and Sergeant Trotter were in the study, re-examining the crime scene, their voices muffled through the walls. Beatrice looked at Miss Marple, her eyes red. "Jane, how do we go on? 2 deaths, and the police suspecting us all. It's unbearable." Her hands trembled, and she dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice gentle. "It's dreadful, Beatrice, but the truth comes out, like a weed you can't hide. In St. Mary Mead, a trap once caught a liar a false clue, and he gave himself away. We just need patience." Her eyes flicked to Clara, who flinched, her handkerchief twisting tighter. Charles stirred, his voice hoarse. "Crane's wasting time. He thinks I did it, uncle, for the money, Diana for I don't know what. I loved her." His hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted his raw grief, but also his fear. Like a cornered animal, Vincent exhaled smoke, his tone light but strained. "They're clutching at straws. Charles, stabbing, poison, it's too much for one man. Someone else is playing a game." He glanced at Miss Marple, his eyes sharp, as if sensing her WATCHFULNESS. Clara said nothing, her face pale, her ring hidden under her sleeve. Miss Marple watched her, recalling the maid's sighting of Clara. Near the library, not in it, just before Diana's death. The ring, the handkerchief, her nervous silence, more signs, but they pointed somewhere. In St. Mary Mead, a nervous maid had confessed to theft when a false clue made her panic. Miss Marple decided it was time to act. She rose, her steps slow, but purposeful, and approached Beatrice. "Dear, might I speak to Inspector Crane? I've been thinking about the study, and a small idea might help." Her voice was mild, but her eyes were keen, already planning her move. Beatrice nodded, her voice faint. "Of course, Jane. He's in the study. I'll take you." She stood, her shawl slipping, and Miss Marple followed, her mind racing. She would share just enough the perfume, the torn note to stir the pot, but keep the hidden letter and the footprints close, like cards in a game. In the study, Crane stood by the desk, the letter opener now in an evidence bag. Trotter was examining. The window, its smudge still visible. Crane looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Marple, you've got something to say." "Just a thought, Inspector," she said, her voice soft. "The perfume in this room was strong, like roses, but sharp. And that note I found in the garden, 'Meet me at midnight.' It suggests Sir Reginald expected someone, perhaps. A reenactment of that night, with all of us here, might jog a memory. People react, you know, when they're reminded." Her eyes twinkled, but her words were pointed, and Crane's pen paused. "A reenactment," he said, frowning. "Risky. But it could work. People slip up under pressure. You've got a sharp mind, Miss Marple." He scribbled a note, then nodded. "We'll try it tonight, after dinner. Everyone in their places, as it was." Miss Marple smiled, her heart quickening. A trap, like in St. Mary Mead, where a false clue about a watch had made the thief blurt out his guilt. Here, the perfume and note would be her bait, and she'd watch who bit, back in the drawing room. She shared the plan with Beatrice, her voice low. "The inspector thinks a reenactment might help. We'll all be in the dining room, then move as we did that night. It's just to clear things up." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes flicked to Clara, then Vincent. Gauging their reactions, Clara's hands froze, her face palling. "A reenactment?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do we have to?" Vincent stubbed out his cigarette, his grin tight. "Sounds like a show. Let's hope it catches the right actor." His eyes met Miss Marple's, and she saw a flicker. of unease, quickly masked. Charles shrugged, his voice dull. Fine. Anything to prove I'm innocent. But his hands shook, and Miss Marple noted his fear, wondering if it was grief or guilt. Dinner was a tense affair. The dining room lit by candles, the air heavy with the scent of roast beef and fear. Miss Marple sat beside Beatrice, her eyes, soft but sharp, watching every glance, every pause. She decided to set her trap now, before the reenactment, to catch the guests off guard. As the soup was served, she spoke, her voice light. It's odd, isn't it, how a scent lingers? That perfume in the study roses, but sharp, like someone wore it that night. And the note I found, meet me at midnight, makes you wonder who Sir Reginald was meeting. She smiled, sipping her soup, but her words landed like pebbles in a pond. Clara's spoon clinked loudly, her face white. Perfume, she said, her voice high. I don't wear any. Her hands shook, and Miss Marple noted the lie, small but clear. Vincent laughed, his tone forced. Perfume's a funny clue. Miss Marple, half the women in London smell like roses. But his fingers tapped the table, his nervous habit, and Miss Marple filed it away. Charles frowned, his voice low. You found a note. Why didn't you say? His eyes were red, his grief raw, but Miss Marple saw his glance at Vincent, sharp with suspicion. Beatrice gasped, her hands fluttering. A note. Oh, Jane, you think it's important. Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her eyes on the others. Just a thought, dear, she said. In St. Mary Mead, a note led to a thief, because he couldn't resist reacting. People give themselves away, you know. Her tone was gentle, but Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief, and Vincent's smile froze. The main course arrived, but the mood was grim. Miss Marple kept the talk light, asking Beatrice about the manners, roses, but her eyes watched the guests. Clara barely ate, her ring glinting as her sleeve slipped. Vincent joked, but his eyes darted to the door. Charles stared at his plate, his hands clenched. The trap was set, and Miss Marple felt the tension like a thread pulled tight. After dinner, Crane gathered the guests in the hall, his voice firm. We're reenacting the night of Sir Reginald's murder. Everyone, take your places as they were after dinner. Drawing room, study, your rooms. Move as you did, and we'll see what shakes loose. His eyes swept the group, lingering on Charles. Then Vincent. Miss Marple stood quietly, her shawl wrapped tight, her mind racing. She'd planted the seed's perfume, the note, and now she'd watch. In St. Mary Mead, a trap had caught a thief. When he checked his pocket, fearing his stolen watch was known. Here, someone would slip, she was sure. The reenactment began. Beatrice sat in the drawing room, pretending to pour coffee. Charles stood by the window, his face tense. Vincent lit a cigarette, his hands steady but his eyes sharp. Clara hovered by the door, her handkerchief crumpled. Miss Marple took her place, her knitting in her lap, her eyes soft but keen. Crane walked them through the night dinner. Coffee, Sir Reginald's exit to the study. Who left first? He asked, his notebook open. I did, Clara said, her voice faint. To my room, to read. But her hands shook, and Miss Marple saw her glance at the garden door, as she had that night. Vincent shrugged. I stayed, smoked a bit, then went up. Nothing odd. But his fingers tapped, and Miss Marple noted his unease. Like the St. Mary Mead thief who'd fidgeted when cornered, Charles muttered, I was with Diana, then went to bed. His voice broke, and Miss Marple saw his grief, but also his fear, wondering if he hid more. Crane nodded, moving to the study. Sir Reginald locked himself in. Then the scream, "Let's go." He led them to the study door, pretending to break it down. Inside, Trotter stood by the desk, playing Sir Reginald, the letter opener in an evidence bag. Miss Marple watched the guests' faces, Clara's pale cheeks, Vincent's tight jaw, Charles's clenched fists. She spoke softly, her voice like a breeze. That perfume, it was so strong here. And the note, someone met him, didn't they? Her eyes twinkled, and Clara gasped, her handkerchief falling. Vincent laughed, too loud. "You're spinning tales, Miss Marple. Perfumes, nothing, just a lady's scent." But his eyes darted to Clara, and Miss Marple filed it away. Crane frowned, his eyes on Clara. "You're jumpy, Miss Clara. Something to say?" "No, I'm just upset," Clara said, her voice trembling. She bent to pick up her handkerchief, and Miss Marple saw her ring glint, her hands shaking. The reenactment ended, the guests returning to the drawing room, their faces tense. Crane scribbled in his notebook, his voice grim. "We'll talk again tomorrow. No one leaves." He glanced at Miss Marple, nodding slightly, as if acknowledging her trap. Miss Marple sat, her knitting resumed, her mind weaving. Clara's panic, Vincent's unease, the hidden letter with V. The trap had worked, stirring reactions. In St. Mary Mead, a false clue had flushed out a thief. Here, the perfume and note had shaken Clara and Vincent, their nerves betraying secrets. The letter, the ring, the footprints, the vial each was a piece. And Miss Marple was close to the truth, ready to pull the final thread. Chapter 11. The final thread. The 6th day at Willow Manor dawned under a heavy sky. The mist outside thick enough to blur the gardens into shadows. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needle silent for once, her half-finished scarf folded neatly in her lap. Her grey dress was immaculate, her brooch pinned precisely, but her blue eyes were sharper than ever, gleaming with the quiet certainty of a puzzle nearly solved. The murders of Sir Reginald Harrow, letter opener, and Diana Voss, poisoned with cyanide in her room, had cast a pall over the house. The guests were worn thin. Charles Harrow hunched in a chair, his grief for Diana raw. Vincent Lyle smoking by the window, his charm a cracked facade. Clara, the governess, twisting her handkerchief, her ring glinting faintly, and Lady Beatrice Harrow, pale and exhausted, clutching a cold cup of tea. Miss Marple's mind wove the clues she'd gathered. The trampled flower bed, the smudged windowsill, the rose-scented perfume in the study, the torn note saying meet. Me at midnight, Vincent's whispered talk of debts, Clara's fine sapphire ring, the monogrammed handkerchief with RH, the cyanide vial in the library, the hidden letter in Diana's room signed V, and the shaky alibi. Alone, Vincent unseen, Clara Meeson, Beatrice distracted. Each was a thread in a pattern now clear to her, like a finished scarf. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a concealed family secreter, maid's hidden birthright, had led to murder, unmasked by a single letter. Here, the truth was close, and Miss Marple was ready to pull the final thread. The drawing room was silent, the air thick with dread. Inspector Crane and Sergeant Trotter were in the study, reviewing evidence, their voices a low murmur. Beatrice looked at Miss Marple, her eyes red. "Jane, it's been days. Will this ever end?" Her voice trembled, her hands twisting her shawl. Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice gentle. It will, Beatrice. In St. Mary Mead, a murder was solved when a trap caught the guilty, their nerves betraying them. Today we'll find the truth. Her eyes flicked to Clara, who froze, her handkerchief dropping, and Vincent, whose cigarette paused mid-air. Charles stirred, his voice hoarse. Crane's still after me. Thinks I killed Uncle for the money. Diana, for I don't know, I didn't do it. His hands clenched, his grief heavy but his fear heavier. And Miss Marple noted his glance at Vincent, sharp with suspicion. Vincent exhaled smoke, his tone strained. They're desperate, Charles. Stabbing Whodunit, too much for one man. Someone's playing us. His eyes met Miss Marple's, and she saw a flicker of unease. Quickly masked, Clara said nothing, her face pale, her ring glinting as her sleeve slipped. Miss Marple watched her, recalling the maid's sighting of Clara near the library. The ring too fine for a governess, the handkerchief with R.H. Reginald Harrow's initials. In St. Mary Mead, a maid's stolen ring had led to a family secret. Her motive tied to a hidden past. Clara's nerves, her knowledge of the manor, her presence near the crime scenes, all pointed to a deeper story. Miss Marple rose, her steps slow but purposeful. Beatrice, dear, might we gather everyone tonight? In the drawing room, after dinner. I've a thought to share with Inspector Crane, something to clear this fog. Her voice was mild, but her eyes were keen, already setting the trap that would end it all. Beatrice nodded, her voice faint. Of course, Jane. Anything to help. She glanced at the others, who watched Miss Marple with wary eyes, Charles with hope, Vincent with suspicion, Clara with fear. Dinner was a grim affair, the dining room lit by flickering candles, the scent of roast lamb heavy in the air. Miss Marple sat beside Beatrice, her eyes soft but sharp, watching every glance, every pause. She spoke little, letting the tension build, but as dessert a simple apple tart was served, she set her trap. It's curious, isn't it? She said, her voice light. How small things tell a story. That perfume in the study, so like roses, but sharp. The note, meet me at midnight, suggesting a secret meeting. And that ring, so fine, worn by someone who knows the manor's every corner. Her eyes twinkled, resting briefly on Clara, who gasped, her fork clinking. Vincent laughed, too loud. You're full of tales, Miss Marple. Perfume and notes. Sounds like a novel. But his fingers tapped the table, his nervous habit, and Miss Marple filed it away. Charles frowned, his voice low. A ring, what's that got to do with it? His eyes darted to Clara, then away, and Miss Marple saw his unease, wondering if he suspected something. Clara's face went white, her hands shaking. I don't know what you mean, she whispered, her ring hidden under her sleeve. But Miss Marple saw the panic, like the St. Mary Mead maidhood crumbled when her stolen ring was mentioned. Beatrice clutched Miss Marple's arm. Jane, you think these things matter? Oh, please, tell Crane. Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her trap tightening. After dinner, Crane gathered the guests in the drawing room, his notebook open, Trotter by his side. Miss Marple has something to share, he said, his voice grim. Let's hear it. His eyes narrowed, as if sensing the moment was near. Miss Marple stood, her shawl wrapped tight, her voice soft but clear. Thank you, Inspector. I'm just an old lady, but in St. Mary Mead, I've seen how small things notes rings. Nervous hands unravel big crimes. Here we have 2 murders. Sir Reginald, stabbed in a locked study, and Diana, poisoned with cyanide. The clues point to someone in this house, someone with a secret tied to the past. Her eyes swept the room, lingering on Clara, who shrank back. She continued, her tone gentle but firm. The trampled flower bed, the smudged windowsill, the perfume, the note, these suggest Sir Reginald met someone at midnight. The cyanide vial in the library, the letter in Diana's room, pay up, or I tell Charles everything, point to blackmail. But the key is the ring, too fine for a governess, and the handkerchief with RH tied to Sir Reginald. She paused, her eyes on Clara, who gasped, her hands trembling. Crane leaned forward, his pen poised. Go on, Miss Marple, who's the killer? Miss Marple smiled, her voice steady. Clara, dear, you've been so nervous. That ring, it's Sir Reginald's, isn't it? A gift, perhaps, from years ago when you were more than a governess. To him, in St. Mary Mead, a maid hid a family secret, her birthright, denied by her father. Here, Clara, you were Sir Reginald's daughter, weren't you? Hidden, unacknowledged, but given that ring as a promise. He changed his will, cutting you out, and you couldn't bear it. Clara's face crumpled, her voice a sob. No, I didn't. I loved him. But her hands clutched the handkerchief, and Miss Marple saw the truth in her eyes. Like the St. Mary Mead maidhood confessed when cornered. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. You met him at midnight, Clara, to plead your case. The note was yours, torn in the garden. You used the window, smudging the sill, and stabbed him in anger when he refused you. Diana found out, perhaps she saw you, or Gastandiu poisoned her glass, using cyanide from the manor's stores. The vial in the library was yours, hidden poorly in panic. Her eyes were kind, but her words were relentless, each one. Tightening the trap, Clara stood, her voice breaking. It wasn't like that. He promised me the manor, said I was his daughter, but then he changed his mind, gave it all to Charles. I begged him, but he laughed, said I was nothing. Didn't mean to. The letter opener was there, and She stopped, sobbing, and Crane stepped forward, his face grim. That's enough, Miss Clara, he said, nodding to Trotter, who gently took her arm. You'll come with us. Clara collapsed, her confession spilling out, the weight of her secret too heavy to bear. Vincent exhaled, his face pale. Good Lord, Miss Marple, you saw it all. His voice was shaky, and Miss Marple noted his relief. The letters V, a red herring, perhaps his own scheme with Diana, but not murder. Charles stared, his grief mixed with shock. Clara, Uncle's daughter. He shook his head, his voice faint. I didn't know. Beatrice clutched Miss Marple's hand, her eyes wide. Jane, how did you know? Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple smiled, her trap complete. Small things, Beatrice, she said. In St. Mary Mead, a maid's ring led to her father's secret, and a trap showed her guilt. Here, Clara's nerves, her ring, the handkerchief, they told the story. People can't hide forever. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes gleamed, the puzzle solved. Crane nodded, his notebook closed. You've done my job for me, Miss Marple. We'll take it from here. He led Clara away, her sobs echoing in the hall. Miss Marple sat, her knitting resumed, her needles clicking softly. The manor was quiet now, the storm past, the truth laid bare. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where small clues always unravelled. Big crimes. Here her genius move a trap of words and clues had stopped a killer, and Willow Manor could begin to heal. Chapter 12. The manor's healing, The seventh day at Willow Manor broke with a tentative sun, its rays piercing the mist that had cloaked the gardens for days. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a nearly finished scarf draped across her lap. Her grey dress was neat, her brooch pinned precisely, and her blue eyes, though gentle, still held a spark of sharpness, like a gardener noting new growth after a storm. The murders of Sir Reginald Harrow stabbed in his locked study with an antique letter opener, and Diana Voss, poisoned with cyanide in her room, had been solved, with Clara, the governess, confessing to both crimes as Sir Reginald's unacknowledged daughter, driven by betrayal over his changed will. The manor was quiet now, but the air carried a weight, as if the walls themselves were exhaling after a long-held breath. The guests were few now, their numbers diminished by tragedy and justice. Charles Harrow sat by the fire, his face less shadowed but still hollow, his grief for Diana softened by the truth's clarity. Lady Beatrice Harrow, his aunt, sat across from Miss Marple, her hands steady for the first time in days, sipping tea that was actually warm. Vincent Lyle, the businessman, lingered by the window, his cigarette unlit, his charm subdued but his eyes restless. Clara was gone, taken by Inspector Crane and Sergeant Trotter to face trial in Danbury, her confession a raw outpouring of anger and sorrow still echoing in the house. Miss Marple's mind wove the clues that had led her to the truth: the trampled flower bed, the smudged window-sill, the rose-scented perfume, the torn note saying, "Meet me at midnight," Vincent's whispered debts, Clara's sapphire ring, the monogrammed handkerchief with R.H., the cyanide vial in the library, and the hidden letter in Diana's room signed V. Each had been a thread, and her trap subtle hints at dinner and a reenactment had unravelled the killer's secret dot. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead, where a family secreter baker's hidden daughter had led to theft but ended in reconciliation when the truth came out. The manor's wounds were deeper, but healing, she knew, came from understanding, not hiding. She looked at Beatrice, whose face, though pale, held a flicker of hope. "Jane," Beatrice said, her voice soft, "you've saved us. I thought we'd never find peace after all this." Miss Marple smiled, her voice gentle. "Peace comes slowly, Beatrice, like roses after winter. In St. Mary Mead, a family mended when secrets were laid bare. You and Charles will mend too." Her eyes flicked to Charles, who nodded faintly, his hands no longer clenched. Charles stirred, his voice low. "I still can't believe it, Clara, Uncle's daughter. I never knew if I could have helped." His eyes were red, but his grief was softer now, tempered by truth. Miss Marple patted his hand, her touch light but warm. "You couldn't know, Charles. Secrets like Clara's fester in silence. In my village, a boy learned his sister was adopted, and it brought them closer, not apart. You'll find your way." Her words were kind, but her mind noted Vincent's silence, his unlit cigarette a sign of unease. The letter, signed V, still lingered, a loose thread she meant to tie. Vincent cleared his throat, his tone forced. "You're a marvel, miss." Marple spotted Clara's guilt like it was written in ink. "But that letter you mentioned, V, you think it was mine?" His grin was weak, and Miss Marple saw his fingers tap his thigh, his nervous habit. She smiled, her voice mild. "Letters can mislead, Mr. Lyle. In St. Mary Mead, a note led us to a thief, but only because he panicked. Your talk of debts, though overheard, in the hall suggested you pressed Diana for money. Not murder, perhaps, but not innocent either. Her eyes twinkled, and Vincent's grin faded, his face paling. "I didn't kill anyone," he said quickly. "Yes, I asked Diana for a lot. Had Charles's money coming, after all. But that's all." His voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noted his relief, as if a heavier guilt had been lifted. Beatrice frowned, her voice soft. "Vincent, you knew Diana was ambitious. Did you know about Clara?" Her hands trembled slightly, and Miss Marple patted them, her eyes on Vincent. He shook his head, lighting his cigarette at last. "Not a clue. Clara was just the governess to me. Quiet, jumpy, never thought she'd cut." He trailed off, exhaling smoke, and Miss Marple saw his unease, but no deeper guilt. The drawing-room door opened, and Inspector Crane entered, his notebook tucked away, his face less grim than before. Sergeant Trotter followed, carrying a tray of evidence bags, now packed for the station. "Miss Marple," Crane said, nodding, "you've done what I couldn't. Clara's confession ties it all. Up Reginald's murder, Diana's poisoning. She admitted to the cyanide, hidden in the library for weeks, and the letter opener grabbed in a rage." His eyes held respect, and Miss Marple smiled, her knitting needle still. "Just small things." "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle. "The ring, the handkerchief, the note they told her story. In St. Mary Mead, a maid's secret unraveled the same way, with a letter and a nervous glance. People can't hide forever." Her words were soft, but her eyes were keen, tying the final knots. Crane nodded, turning to Beatrice. "Lady Harrow, we'll need statements for the trial, but the case is closed. Clara acted alone, driven by her father's rejection. We found no evidence against anyone else." His eyes flicked to Vincent, then Charles, and Miss Marple noted his careful tone, as if ensuring no loose ends. Charles looked up, his voice steady for the first time. "What about the will?" Clara said. "Uncle cut her out. Is it mine now?" His eyes held hope, but also guilt, and Miss Marple saw his struggle to move forward. Beatrice answered, her voice soft. "Reginald's lawyer is coming tomorrow. You'll inherit the manor, Charles, as he intended, but will honor his memory, not his anger." Her hands were steady now, and Miss Marple smiled. Seeing the healing begin, Vincent stubbed out his cigarette, his tone lighter. "Well, that's that then. Time to move on, I suppose." But his eyes darted to Miss Marple, as if fearing she saw more, and she did the letters V was his. A blackmail attempt on Diana, but not murder. She let it pass, knowing some secrets didn't need airing. The day unfolded quietly, the manor settling into a new rhythm. Lunch was simple sandwiches, and fruit but the guests ate, their appetites returning. Miss Marple spoke to Charles, her voice kind. "You'll rebuild, dear. The manor's yours, but it's the heart you put into it that matters. In St. Mary Mead, a young man took over his father's shop after a theft and made it better. You will too." Her eyes twinkled, and Charles nodded, a faint smile breaking through. Beatrice joined them, her voice stronger. "Jane, you must stay longer. The roses are still blooming, and we need you." Her hands clasped Miss Marple's, and the warmth was genuine. "I'll stay a day or two," Miss Marple said, smiling. "But St. Mary Mead calls me back. My own roses need tending." Her tone was light, but her mind lingered on the Cluse, the perfume, the smudge, the footprints. All fit Clara's guilt, but the perfume nagged at her, a faint loose thread. Diana's scent was similar, but Clara's denial of wearing any was too quick. Perhaps a borrowed bottle, she thought, or a deliberate mislead. As evening fell, Vincent announced his departure, his bags packed. "London's waiting," he said, his grin back but shaky. "No offence, but this place is too lively for me." He shook Charles's hand, nodded to Beatrice, and paused before Miss Marple, his eyes wary. "You're a sharp one, Miss Marple. Hope we don't cross paths in a dark alley." His laugh was forced, and she smiled, her silence louder than words, alone. With Beatrice in the drawing-room, Miss Marple knitted, her needles clicking, her mind at rest but still turning. "The manor will heal, Beatrice," she said, "like a garden after a storm. In St. Mary Mead, a family came together after a secret was told. You and Charles will do the same." Her eyes were soft, but her heart was sure, the puzzle complete. The next morning, as she packed for St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple stood by her window, looking at the garden. The trampled flower bed was being tended by a gardener, new roses planted to replace the broken ones. She thought of Clara, her rage and sorrow, and of the St. Mary Mead maid, whose confession had brought peace. The manor was healing, its secrets laid bare, and Miss Marple's genius move a trap of words and clues had stopped a killer, leaving hope in its wake. Chapter 13. A quiet departure. The 8th day at Willow Manor dawned with a soft, golden light, the mist that had shrouded the gardens finally lifting to reveal a crisp October morning. Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room, packing her small suitcase with care, her grey dress neat, her brooch pinned precisely. Her knitting needles rested in their bag, the scarf she'd worked on all week now finished, folded neatly beside her. Her blue eyes, still sharp but softened by a gentle calm, gazed out the window at the rose garden below, where a gardener was tending the trampled flower bed, planting new blooms to replace the broken ones. The murders of Sir Reginald Harris. In his locked study with an antique letter, opener owned Diana Voss, poisoned with cyanide in her room, had been solved, with Clara, the governess, confessing as Sir Reginald's unacknowledged daughter, driven by betrayal over his changed will. The manor was quiet now, its secrets laid bare, and a sense of healing was beginning to take root. Like new shoots after a storm, Miss Marple's mind traced the clues that had led to the truth. The trampled flower bed, the smudged windowsill, the rose-scented perfume in the study, the torn note saying, "Meet me at midnight." Vincent Lyle's whispered talk of debts, Clara's sapphire ring, the monogrammed handkerchief with R.H., the cyanide vial in the library, the hidden letter in Diana's room signed V, and the shaky alibis Charles alone. Vincent unseen, Clara Meeson, Beatrice distracted. Each had been a thread in a tangled pattern, unravelled by her trap of subtle hints and a reenactment that provoked Clara's confession. She thought of St. Mary Mead, her village, where a theft had torn a community apart, only to mend when the Truther Baker's hidden kindness brought people together. Here, Willow Manor was on a similar path, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, like finishing a perfect stitch. Downstairs, the drawing-room was brighter today, the curtains drawn back to let in the sun. Lady Beatrice Harrow sat by the fire, her face less pale, her hands steady as she poured tea. Charles Harrow stood by the window, his grief for Diana still heavy but softened by purpose, his eyes fixed on the garden. Vincent Lyle had left the previous evening, his bags packed for London, his charm masking a hurried exit. Miss Marple had noted his relief, the letter signed V a sign of his blackmail attempt on Diana, but not murder. Clara was in Danbury, awaiting trial, her confession a weight lifted from the manor but a shadow on her future. Beatrice looked up as Miss Marple entered, her suitcase in hand. "Jane, you're not leaving already?" Her voice held a note of panic, her hands clutching her shawl. "We need you here. The manor feels empty without you." Miss Marple smiled, setting her suitcase down and taking a seat. "My dear Beatrice, I've stayed longer than planned, but St. Mary Mead calls me back. My roses need tending, and you and Charles are stronger than you know. In St. Mary Mead, a village healed after a theft because people faced the truth. You will too." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were warm. Seeing the strength in Beatrice's steady hands, Charles turned from the window, his voice low but steady. "Miss Marple, I don't know how to thank you. You saw what we couldn't. Clara, Uncle's daughter, all of it. I feel like I failed them both." His hands were still, his grief tempered by resolve, and Miss Marple nodded, her heart warmed. "By his growth, you didn't fail, Charles," she said, her voice kind. "Secrets hide from us all, like weeds in a garden. In St. Mary Mead, a young man learned his father's secreter, debt forgiven, and it made him kinder. You'll make the manor kinder too, for Reginald's sake." Her eyes twinkled, and Charles managed a faint smile, his shoulders straightening. Beatrice poured tea, her hands steady now. "The lawyer came yesterday," she said. "Charles inherits the manor, as Reginald wanted. We'll keep it in the family, make it a home again." Her voice held hope, and Miss Marple saw the manor's future, like a garden blooming anew. "That's the spirit, Beatrice," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "Homes heal when hearts do. In my village, a baker's kindness brought neighbors together after a theft. You and Charles will do the same." Her eyes flicked to the garden, where the new roses glowed, a sign of renewal. The morning passed quietly, the manor settling into a new rhythm. Inspector Crane arrived, his notebook tucked away, his face less grim. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding, "you've left me little to do. Clara's trial is set, and her confession holds Reginald's murder was a moment of rage. Diana's a panicked cover-up. The evidence fits, the ring, the note, the vial." His eyes held respect, and Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag at her side. "Just small things, Inspector," she said, her voice mild. "In St. Mary Mead, a letter caught a thief because it was misplaced. Here, Clara's nerves and her ring told the tale. People can't hide forever." Her words were gentle, but her eyes gleamed, the puzzle complete. Crane nodded, turning to Beatrice. "We'll need you and Mr. Harrow for statements, but the case is closed. You can start rebuilding." He glanced at Charles, who nodded, his face set with determination. After Crane left, Miss Marple spoke to Charles, her voice low. "The letter signed V. Vincent's work, wasn't it? Not murder, but pressure on Diana. Did you know?" Her eyes were soft but keen, tying the final thread. Charles flushed, his voice quiet. "I suspected. Diana was ambitious, wanted the manor's wealth. Vincent saw it, tried to use it. I didn't want to believe it." His hands were steady, his honesty clear, and Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "a girl's ambition led to trouble, but her brother forgave her. You'll forgive Diana's memory, Charles, and make the manor yours." Her tone was kind, and Charles nodded, his eyes clearer. Lunch was a simple affair: soup and bread eaten with appetite. Beatrice spoke of plans to restore the rose garden, Charles of opening the manor to the village for events. Miss Marple listened, her heart light, seeing the healing take root. She thought of the perfume, the one loose thread Clara's denial. Yet the scent matched Diana's. Perhaps Clara had borrowed it, a small act to blend in or to mislead. It didn't matter now. The truth was out. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple prepared to leave, her suitcase by the door. Beatrice walked her to the hall, her eyes misty. "Jane, you've given us hope. How do we thank you?" Her hands clasped Miss Marple's, warm and steady. "Live well, Beatrice," Miss Marple said, smiling. "That's thanks enough. In Merry Mead, a village healed because people chose kindness. You will too." Her eyes twinkled, and Beatrice hugged her, a rare gesture. Charles joined them, carrying her suitcase to the waiting car. "Miss Marple, you're welcome back, any time. The manor's home because of you." His voice was strong, his grief a shadow now, not a weight. Miss Marple nodded, her shawl wrapped tight. "I'll visit Charles when my roses can spare me." She smiled, stepping into the car, her knitting bag at her side. As the manor faded behind her, she looked at the gardens, the new roses bright against the green. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where small clues had always led to big truths, and of Willow Manor, where her genius move a trap of words and clues had stopped a killer and restored a home. The car rolled toward the station, and Miss Marple sat back, her mind at rest, the puzzle complete. The manor would heal, its secrets laid bare, and she was ready for St. Mary Mead, where her own roses waited, and new stories, perhaps, would bloom.